इस वीडियो में हम बात करने वाले हैं जॉर्डन पीटरसन और रिचर्ड डॉकिंस की जो डिबेट हुई है उसके बारे में। इस डिबेट को मैं आपको शुद्ध हिंदी में एक्सप्लेन करने वाला हूँ। इस डिबेट में पीटरसन और डॉकिंस मेनली बात कर रहे हैं रिलीजन या रिलीजियस नैरेटिव के बारे में। रिलीजियस नैरेटिव ये एक चीज दो लोग कैसे अलग अलग तरीके से परसीव करते हैं, ये हम आज इस वीडियो में देखने वाले हैं। वीडियो लंबा हो सकता है लेकिन इसमें आपको 1000% कुछ ना कुछ तो अलग सीखने के लिए मिलेगा। सो वीडियो को लाइक कर दीजिए, चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और बेल आइकन को प्रेस कर दीजिए ताकि जब मैं नया वीडियो अपलोड करूँ आप तक नोटिफिकेशन पहुंच जाए। सो लेट्स बिगिन। सबसे पहले मैं इस डिबेट के बारे में और पीटरसन और डॉकिंस के बारे में एक ब्रीफ आइडिया या फिर इंट्रोडक्शन दे देता हूँ। पीटरसन एक क्लिनिकल साइकोलॉजिस्ट है एंड ही इज अ कल्चरल क्रिटिक और वो बात करते हैं अबाउट रिलीजियस नैरेटिव्स। उन रिलीजियस नैरेटिव्स का जो साइकोलॉजिकल और सोशल सिग्निफिकेंस है उसके बारे में। उनका कहना है कि बाइबल की जो स्टोरीज है वो अपने आप में बहुत ज़्यादा इम्पोर्टेंस होल्ड करती है और बाइबल और उसकी स्टोरीज इंसान को मीनिंग देती है और उसके लाइफ को स्ट्रक्चर देती है। ये पीटरसन का मानना है। पीटरसन का मेन फोकस है आर्केटाइप्स और मिथोलॉजी के ऊपर। मिथोलॉजी में जो सिंबोलिज्म्स है उस सिंबोलिज्म का अपने जीवन में बहुत ज्यादा इंपॉर्टेंस है, ऐसा पीटरसन का मानना है। और आर्केटाइप्स का जो कॉन्सेप्ट है वो दिया है स्विस साइकियाट्रिस्ट कार्ल यूंग ने। इसके बारे में भी हम आगे बात करेंगे। पीटरसन मानते हैं कि ह्यूमन साइकोलॉजी उसके एथिक्स और बिहेवियर को समझने के लिए ये जो आर्केटाइप्स होते हैं, ये जो स्टोरीज होते हैं, मिथोलॉजी होती है, ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट रोल प्ले करता है। और उनका स्टांस होता है कि वो अक्सर रिलीजन को डिफेंड करते हैं। ऑन द अदर हैंड प्रोफेसर रिचर्ड डॉकिंस एक इवोल्यूशनरी बायोलॉजिस्ट है। ही इज एन आउटस्पोकन एथियस्ट। वो एक नास्तिक व्यक्ति है, वो भगवान को नहीं मानते हैं। रिलीजन में जो कुरीतियां चल रही है, जो सुपरस्टिशन चल रहे हैं, उनके बारे में वो मुखर होकर आवाज उठाते हैं और वो साइंटिफिक रीजनिंग प्रमोट करते हैं। उनका मेन फोकस है एम्पिरिकल एविडेंस और रैशनैलिटी के ऊपर और इसीलिए जो रिलीजियस बिलीफ्स है वो उनको अनसाइंटिफिक या फिर सूडो साइंटिफिक करके क्रिटिसाइज करता है। ये डिबेट पीटरसन और डॉकिंस के बीच में जो फिलोसॉफिकल डिवाइड है उसको हाईलाइट करती है। पीटरसन मानते हैं कि रिलीजन या फिर रिलीजियस नैरेटिव्स के बहुत सारे फायदे होते हैं, इससे सोशल कोहीजन बढ़ता है, लेकिन डॉकिंस का स्टांस मेनली साइंटिफिक है। ही इज सेक्युलर और वो दुनिया को साइंस के हिसाब से या फिर साइंटिफिक फैक्ट्स के हिसाब से समझना चाहते हैं। उनको रिलीजियस नैरेटिव्स या मिथोलॉजी इन सब से कुछ लेना देना है नहीं। डॉकिंस रिलीजन, रिलीजियस नैरेटिव्स, मिथोलॉजी, स्टोरीज, सिंबल्स, इन सारे चीज़ों के ऊपर साइंस को रखते हैं, साइंटिफिक एडवांसमेंट को रखते हैं, इवोल्यूशन को रखते हैं। और उनके हिसाब से ये जो सारी चीजें हैं वो कई ज्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट है रिलीजियस नैरेटिव्स और मिथोलॉजी से। सो अब हम चलते हैं स्क्रीन के ऊपर और देखते हैं कि पीटरसन रिलीजन को और रिलीजियस नैरेटिव्स को कैसे डिपेंड करते हैं, डॉकिंस का उसके ऊपर काउंटर क्या होता है, और एलेक्स ओकॉनर जो इस डिबेट को मीडिएट कर रहा है वो कैसे मॉरली जस्टिफाई कर पाता है अपने मस्टैश को। सो लेट्स बिगिन।
I think our first point of contact, in the spirit of finding those overlapping circles of interest between you two, will be the similarities, if there are any, between the concept of a meme and the concept of an archetype. So, Professor Dawkins, perhaps you can begin by telling us, what is a meme?
A meme is a virus of the mind. So it's something that spreads because it spreads because it spreads. It's something that spreads by imitation. As I understand it, an archetype is quite different from that, because an archetype is something which all humans have. As a virtue of being human, something that's built in. So it's not something that spreads as an epidemic. It's something that we all have anyway. And I suppose that it could turn into a meme, but I would think it would be muddying the waters to even say that there's something very much in common between an archetype and a meme.
Memes are not embedded into the psychology of people as
No,
naturally
they
as
arise.
an archetype.
They're things like the backwards baseball hat, which is not an archetype. I mean, it's something that becomes fashionable and spreads as an epidemic around the population, which is very different from an archetype, which is sort of built in.
Yes, I've heard you in the past, Dr. Peterson.
सो एलेक्स ने प्रीवियसली पीटरसन का एक इंटरव्यू लिया था और उसमें इस मीम और आर्कीटाइप के बारे में उन्होंने बात की थी। मैंने उस पर एक लाइव रिएक्शन भी किया था। वो रिएक्शन वीडियो अभी चैनल पे अवेलेबल नहीं है, लेकिन उस पे जॉर्डन पीटरसन बात कर रहे थे। हम जॉर्डन पीटरसन को शॉर्ट में जेपी कहेंगे, ओके। उस वीडियो में जेपी बात करते हैं कि द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ मीम्स इज एग्जैक्टली सिमिलर टू द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ आर्कीटाइप्स। सो मीम्स क्या होते हैं ये सबसे पहले हम समझते हैं, ठीक है। मीम्स मतलब कुछ आइडियाज होती है जो कल्चरली स्प्रेड होती है। सो इस मीम को तुम इंटरनेट मीम्स के रेफरेंस से समझ सकते हो। जो भी मीम सबसे ज्यादा शेयर की गई है वो स्प्रेड होती है, वो फेमस हो जाती है, और डॉकिंस इन मीम्स को कंपेयर करते हैं जीन्स के साथ. सो इंस्टेड ऑफ बायोलॉजिकल ट्रेट्स, मीम्स जो होती है दे आर आइडियाज और कल्चरल इंफॉर्मेशन जो स्प्रेड होती है फ्रॉम वन पर्सन टू अनदर. और मीम्स कुछ भी हो सकती है. इट कुड बी अ फैशन ट्रेंड, इट कुड बी अ कैच फ्रेज. और मीम्स एक दूसरे के साथ compete करती है फॉर अटेंशन. मीम्स एक दूसरे के साथ सर्वाइव करने के लिए compete करती है, जस्ट लाइक इंटरनेट मीम्स. और ये जो मीम्स है वो स्प्रेड होती है कम्युनिकेशन से या फिर इमिटेशन से. मतलब जितना ज़्यादा इन मीम्स के बारे में लोग बात करेंगे, जितना ज़्यादा लोगों का इंटरेक्शन होगा, जितना ज़्यादा लोग इन इमिटेट करेंगे मतलब नकल करेंगे, उतनी ही ज़्यादा वो मीम स्प्रेड होगी. इन शॉर्ट, मीम मतलब एक पीस ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन होती है जो लोग शेयर करते हैं. अगर कोई आइडिया बहुत ज़्यादा कैची है तो ज़्यादा लोग उसको अडॉप्ट करेंगे, ज़्यादा लोग उसको शेयर करेंगे. जस्ट लाइक एनी पॉपुलर वीडियो जो इंटरनेट पे वायरल होता है, जितने ज़्यादा लोग उस वीडियो को पसंद करते हैं उतना ही ज़्यादा लोग उसको शेयर करते हैं. और वो वीडियो फिर ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा लोगों तक पहुंचता है. जो रिलीजियस बिलीफ्स होते हैं वो भी ओवर टाइम स्प्रेड होते हैं. द आइडिया ऑफ द हायर बीइंग, ये एक पर्सन से दूसरे पर्सन तक स्प्रेड होती है. और एक तरीके से तुम कह सकते हो कि दिस इज ऑल्सो अ पार्ट ऑफ मीम. हमारे जो सोशल नॉर्म्स होते हैं, जैसे कि थैंक यू बोलना, सॉरी बोलना, ग्रीट करना किसी को, दिस इज ऑल्सो पार्ट ऑफ मीम. या फिर कई फैशन ट्रेंड्स हो गए, वो भी मीम्स का हिस्सा है. ऑन द अदर हैंड, यूंगियन आर्केटाइप्स के हिसाब से माइंड इज नॉट अ ब्लैंक स्लेट. कुछ ऐसे यूनिवर्सल सिंबल्स होते हैं, कुछ ऐसी यूनिवर्सल थीम्स होती है, जब हम पैदा होते हैं वो तभी हमारे अंदर मौजूद होती हैं. इसको कार्ल यूंग बोलते हैं आर्केटाइप्स. और वो मेजरली 12 तरीके के आर्केटाइप्स पुट फॉरवर्ड करता है. मैंने कार्ल यूंग के ऊपर एक डिटेल में वीडियो बनाया है. उसमें मैंने शैडो क्या होती है, आर्केटाइप्स क्या होते हैं, एनिमा एनिमस क्या होता है, हम शैडो को कैसे इनकॉर्पोरेट कर सकते हैं, इन सारी चीज़ों के बारे में बात करी है. इस वीडियो का लिंक मैंने आपको डिस्क्रिप्शन में दिया है. सो अगर आपको कार्ल यूंग के बारे में ज़्यादा जानकारी चाहिए तो सबसे पहले मैं आपको रिक्वेस्ट करूंगा कि जाके वो वीडियो देखिए, और वो वीडियो देखने के बाद फिर ये वीडियो प्ले करिए. तब आपको जेपी या फिर डॉकिंस जिस बारे में बात कर रहे हैं वो बात ज़्यादा अच्छी तरीके से समझ में आएगी. कार्ल यूंग का मानना था कि ये जो सारे हमारे बिलीव्स होते हैं वो हमारे एंसेस्टर से हमें इनहेरिटेड होते हैं. सो फॉर मिलियंस ऑफ ईयर्स हमारे जितने भी सारे एंसेस्टर्स हैं उनको कोई ना कोई तो एक्सपीरियंसेस हुए रहते हैं. और वो एक्सपीरियंसेस एक पीढ़ी से लेके दूसरी पीढ़ी तक पास ऑन होते हैं. और वो स्टोर होते हैं हमारे कलेक्टिव अनकॉन्शियस में. और वो स्टोर होते हैं इन द फॉर्म ऑफ सिंबल्स. और ये सिंबल सबके लिए, पूरे ह्यूमैनिटी के लिए सेम होते हैं. सो इट्स लाइक कि अगर कोई सरपेंट की बात कर रहा है, स्नेक की बात कर रहा है, तो स्नेक एक चीज सिंबलाइज करेगा और वो सिंबल यूनिवर्सल होगा. और हमारी जितनी भी सारी मिथोलॉजी है, जितनी भी सारी स्टोरीज है, हमें जो सपने आते हैं उन सपनों में हमें ये सिंबल्स दिखाई देते हैं. और हर एक ड्रीम का, हर एक सिंबल का कोई ना कोई तो मीनिंग होता है. और जेपी यहाँ पे बोल रहे हैं कि आर्केटाइप्स और मीम्स दोनों ही सिमिलर होते हैं. और रिचर्ड डॉकिंस का आर्गुमेंट ये है कि दोनों सिमिलर नहीं होते, ये दोनों कंप्लीटली अलग अलग चीज़ें हैं. मीम्स वायरस की तरह स्प्रेड होते हैं और आर्केटाइप्स हमारे अंदर मौजूद होते हैं.
Say that a meme is very similar, if not almost identical to an archetype, almost as if you kept pushing the idea of what a meme is, you might end up with an archetype. But
Well,
perhaps
I
not.
think maybe the appropriate way of tying the two ideas together, given what Dr. Dawkins just said, is to notice the fact that something spreads because it catches, right? And so things catch because they have an emotional resonance, and so they attract people's interest, and so they attract them in an exploratory manner. That'd be one way of thinking about it. That would be attraction on the positive emotion side, or they attract them on the negative emotion side. And so that would loop the idea of the catchiness of a idea, a meme, let's say, with the more underlying motivational structures. And as the idea is more related to the action of underlying biological motivational structures, it becomes more and more expression of something that's instinctual and archetypal. Like Jung defined an archetype essentially as something like the manifestation of an instinct in image and then also in behavior. So the deepest level is something like the instinct, and that would be motivational or emotional drive. And then there's a manifestation of that in imagination and behavior, and it's more culturally constructed there. Then you could also imagine that there are depths of these ideas. The baseball hat idea, for example, that would be something that's manifesting itself at a fairly shallow level. But there's a reason that the backwards baseball hat caught on. You know, it speaks of the moment for whatever reason. And it's linked to the biology through the fact that it captures interest for some reason.
So perhaps something like the archetype being a more fundamental psychological concept that memes can then play upon. The backwards catches on.
Well, that
सो जेपी यहाँ पे बात करते हैं कि जो हमारे विचार होते हैं, हमारे थॉट्स होते हैं, वो जुड़े होते हैं हमारे इमोशंस के साथ, चाहे वो अच्छे इमोशंस हो या बुरे इमोशंस हो। लेकिन जो इमोशंस हमें अट्रैक्ट करते हैं, हमारा अटेंशन ग्रैब करते हैं, वो सबसे तेज फैलते हैं और इस वजह से कुछ थॉट्स जो है वो टिक जाते हैं। इन शॉर्ट जेपी बताना चाह रहे हैं कि जो कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ आर्किटाइप्स है वो एक कोर कॉन्सेप्ट है, वो फंडामेंटल कॉन्सेप्ट है। और उस आर्किटाइप्स के ऊपर अगर हम जाए सतही लेवल पे, तो मीम्स मतलब एक सतही लेवल की कॉन्सेप्ट है। सो डॉकिंस एग्जांपल दे रहे हैं रिवर्स बेसबॉल हैट का, हम उल्टी टोपी पहनते हैं, उस टोपी का वो एग्जांपल दे रहे हैं। सो जेपी यहाँ पे बोलते हैं कि अगर कोई ऐसा कर रहा है, अगर कोई उल्टी टोपी पहन रहा है, तो वो क्यों पहन रहा है? अगर तुम सिर्फ ये बोल रहे हो कि सामने वाला उल्टी टोपी इसीलिए पहन रहा है क्योंकि सोसाइटी में और कल्चर में सारे लोग ऐसा कर रहे हैं और वो चीज़ें उसको अट्रैक्ट कर गई इसलिए वो ऐसा कर रहा है, तो ये सिर्फ एक सुपरफिशियल लेवल पे बात हुई। इस चीज़ का कोई डीपर सिग्निफिकेंस है। ये फैशन ट्रेंड्स वगैरह ये सारी चीज़ें हैं, हमें एट द फर्स्ट साइट हमें शालो लग सकती है, लेकिन अगर हम डीप में जाके देखें तो वो हमारे डीपर बायोलॉजिकल इंस्टिंक्ट्स या फिर इमोशनल ड्राइव्स के साथ जुड़ी हुई होती है, इसीलिए हम वो चीज़ें करते हैं। इन शॉर्ट मीम्स जो है वो स्प्रेड होती है आर्केटाइप्स की वजह से। आर्केटाइप कोर में होता है और आर्केटाइप की वजह से बाकी सारी चीज़ें होती हैं, ऐसा जॉर्डन पीटरसन का मानना है।
seems implausible to me, but the idea that the archetype could be a reason why some memes spread, that seems to me to be plausible if you believe in archetypes at all. Yes.
But you prefer to think of memes, or you do think of
सो ये दोनों यहाँ पे अग्री कर रहे हैं कि आर्केटाइप्स की वजह से मीम स्प्रेड होती है और आर्केटाइप कोर में होता है।
memes as you refer to them as a virus.
Yes,
It doesn't have to have a negative
it's the
connotation.
spreadability which is the salient point. And if chiming in with an archetype is a reason why they might spread, then I could go with that.
Yeah, and presumably archetypes don't act in the same way. They don't spread through cultures. They don't sort of grow up and die in individual generations. They're much more foundational than that.
I think you have to think about it hierarchically. You know, that there's something in the structure that would make itself manifest as an archetype. There's something that's foundational and deep that wouldn't change any faster in a sense than the species itself changes. But then there would be efflorescences of that idea that would be less permanent as they were more attuned to the specifics of the time. So, and that's not saying anything different really than saying that there are ideas that make themselves manifest at different levels of depth, which is also a complex thing. Like it's not that easy to specify what makes an idea deep, which makes it more archetypal, and what makes it transient and trivial. There's a relationship between such ideas. There's no idea so trivial that it doesn't touch the depths because no one would care about it, right? So, but archetypal ideas do have that capacity to spread virally and to rise and fall. You see that, I think you see that in the history of religious ideas. You know, that religious ideas can be very catching because otherwise they wouldn't spread. Now, there's variation in them like there is in languages, but there's also something that's core that makes them identifiable, let's say, as religious ideas rather than as any other sort of idea. I mean, one of the things I was really interested about, I sent you an email at one time asking you if you had read Mircea Eliade, especially The Sacred and the Profane, but he also has a 3-book series called A History of Religious Ideas. And I really like A History of Religious Ideas. It's a great book. And one of the things it does is analyze a particular widespread religious motif, which is the battle between the gods in heaven. You see this idea in many, many cultures, and each god is the expression of a mode of perception or a mode of being. And what you see happening in a multitude of cultures is that there are many, many ways of seeing the world and acting in it that are metamorphized into something divine. And as cultures mingle and mix, their gods compete in the space of the imagination, and something like a hierarchy forms. That's the emergence of something like monotheism. And
सो जेपी यहाँ पे कहना चाह रहे हैं कि हर एक कल्चर का अलग अलग गॉड होता है, और वो जो गॉड होता है वो पर्सन टू पर्सन या फिर कल्चर टू कल्चर वेरी करता है, और वो भगवान इंस्पायर्ड होता है ह्यूमन मोटिवेशन से, परसेप्शन से, जो लोग उस कल्चर में रह रहे हैं, उस सोसाइटी में रह रहे हैं, उनके एक्सपीरियंसेस से। और वो गॉड हमें दर्शाता है, वो गॉड हमें सिग्निफाई करता है कि उस टाइम पीरियड में लोग वर्ल्ड को कैसे परसीव कर रहे हैं। और जब ऐसे वेरियस कल्चर्स इकट्ठा होते हैं तो वो एक दूसरे के साथ compete करते हैं फॉर सर्वाइवल। वो कल्चर्स लोगों के दिमाग में अपना एक इम्पोर्टेंट स्थान बनाना चाहते हैं। वो कल्चर चाहते हैं कि हमें लोगों ने रिकॉग्नाइज करना चाहिए, और इन दोनों कल्चर के मिक्स होने से हमारा जो गॉड का परसेप्शन है वो फिर चेंज हो जाता है। और इस कल्चरल मिक्सिंग की वजह से एक हायरार्की तैयार हो जाती है, जहाँ पे एक गॉड दूसरे के साथ compete कर रहा है। और जब एक गॉड दूसरे गॉड से ज्यादा डोमिनेंट पोजीशन हासिल कर लेता है, तब जेपी कहता है कि तब आता है मोनोथीज्म, मतलब बिलीफ इन ओनली वन गॉड।
We've been talking a little bit about the concept of a meme. I think it would be strange to be suspicious of the idea that memes are a thing that do exist and transmit, but there might be more room for suspicion about this concept of the archetype. I was wondering, Professor Dawkins, what you think about the concept of archetypes in general.
Well, for example, if we take the idea of the gods competing with each other, that I take it is a proper archetype because it's present in all cultures. I presume you mean it's something that's built in genetically, ultimately, I suppose, that something about our brains makes different cultures invent the same kinds of religious symbols.
Yes.
And things like a battle between gods is one.
that's one.
And there might be others. It's not that convincing. I mean, it's such an obvious thing because we have human battles, and therefore an idea of battles between gods would not be that implausible. So it doesn't strike me as a very penetrating observation.
Well, I think the thing that's interesting
यहाँ पे डॉकिंस काइंड ऑफ जो आर्कीटाइप्स की जो आइडिया है उसको डाउन प्ले करते हुए दिखाई दे रहे हैं, क्योंकि एक जगह पे वो मानते हैं कि ये मीम्स है, और मीम्स फंडामेंटली आ रहा है आर्कीटाइप से, मतलब मीम्स के कोर में आर्कीटाइप्स है। और ये भी बात एक्सेप्ट कर रहे हैं कि हमारे अंदर कुछ यूनिवर्सल सिंबल्स होते हैं, लेकिन उनका कहना है कि दिस इज बिकॉज ऑफ जीन्स, और हमने बैटल्स देखी हुई है, इसलिए हम इमेजिन कर पाते हैं कि गॉड्स भी जैसे ह्यूमंस लड़ते हैं वैसे गॉड्स भी लड़ रहे होंगे।
well, I think the thing
एक चीज आपने ऑब्जर्व करी कि खास इस डिबेट के लिए रिचर्ड डॉकिंस ये डीएनए वाला टाई पहन के आए हैं। और अगर हम जॉर्डन पीटरसन की बात करें
that's been interesting to
तो पीटरसन, अगर हम इनके सूट पर जूम करते हैं तो मुझे पता नहीं आपको कितना दिख पा रहा होगा, लेकिन उनके सूट पर लिखा हुआ है क्लीन योर रूम, क्लीन योर रूम, क्लीन योर रूम। पूरे सूट पर यही लिखा है क्लीन योर रूम। और इस चीज़ का एट्रीब्यूशन पीटरसन को दिया जाता है कि वो बोलते रहते कि अपना रूम क्लीन करो। तो जस्ट माइन्यूट ऑब्जर्वेशन जो मैंने नोटिस किया। एनीवेज,
me about it is to start to understand the nature of the universal themes and how they're expressed in stories. I mean, one of the things I wanted to explore with you, because I think this is an idea that's at the core of the cultural conflict, is the postmodern types seem to have stumbled onto something which I actually think is true. And they're not the only discipline that's come to this realization, because you can see it emerging in neuroscience and in AI and in robotics as well, that we see the world of facts through something that when described as a story, because we have to prioritize our perceptions, we have to prioritize facts. And as far as I can tell, a story is a verbal account of how our perceptions and the facts that we encounter are prioritized. So for example, when you go see a movie, the movie has a hero, and what the writers do is they show you how the hero prioritizes his perceptions, what he attends to and how he acts, and you derive from that the story of his life and his ethic. And the idea that we have a story, that we have to organize our perceptions in priority, and that the description of that organization is a story, that's a very revolutionary idea. And I think the postmodernists got that right. And I think that's why we have a culture war going on, at least in part, is because the idea that we see the world through a story, or that a story is a description of the structure through which we see the world, I think that's accurate, because we have to prioritize our perceptions.
So,
And
Professor
that's
Dawkins,
a tricky problem.
Well, I would prioritize my
सो जॉर्डन पीटरसन यहाँ पे बताना चाह रहे हैं कि हम कहानियों के माध्यम से हम इस दुनिया को समझते हैं। उनका कहना है कि ये कहानियाँ हमें अपने अनुभव और हमारे लाइफ की जो कॉम्प्लिकेटेड सिचुएशंस होती है उनको समझने में मदद करती है। और जब हम घटनाओं को इन कहानियों के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से देखते हैं तब हम उनको बेटर अंडरस्टैंड कर सकते हैं। हम स्टोरीज और नैरेटिव से फैक्ट को अच्छी तरीके से समझ सकते हैं। और जेपी कहते हैं कि इन्हीं स्टोरीज की वजह से, इन्हीं कहानियों की वजह से, इन्हीं नैरेटिव्स की वजह से हमारे लाइफ को मीनिंग मिल सकता है और हम हमारी लाइफ में जो स्ट्रगल्स है, जो चुनौतियां हैं, उनका सामना कर सकते हैं।
Perceptions like this.
Professor
That's a
Dawkins.
tricky problem.
Well, I would prioritize my perceptions like this. The facts that I care about are the facts that are true and have evidence going for them. I'm not that interested in symbols. I think, Dr. Peterson, you're drunk on symbols.
Yes, you mentioned. I've heard
तो इन्होंने पहले आई थिंक ये कमेंट किया था कि डॉक्टर पीटरसन इज ड्रंक ऑन सिंबल्स। इट्स काइंड ऑफ एन इंसल्टिंग कमेंट कि डॉक्टर पीटरसन हमेशा सिंबल्स के बारे में बात करते रहते हैं। सो इसलिए उन्होंने बोला कि पीटरसन इज ड्रंक ऑन सिंबल्स। और यहाँ पे पीटरसन बात कर रहे हैं स्टोरी के बारे में, नैरेटिव्स के बारे में, और तुम उस स्टोरी के थ्रू, तुम इस नैरेटिव के थ्रू एक मीनिंग पा सकते हो, तुम्हें एक डायरेक्शन मिल सकता है किसी चीज को करने का, कोई मोटिव मिल सकता है। लेकिन डॉकिंस यहाँ पे बोल रहे हैं कि आई डोंट केयर अबाउट सिंबल्स एंड ऑल दिस थिंग्स। मुझे ये फर्क नहीं पड़ता कि ये चीजें क्या सिखा रही है, मुझे सिर्फ ये फर्क पड़ता है कि हार्डकोर फैक्ट क्या है।
that comment. Yeah.
Yes.
और उन्हें सिंबोलिज्म से कुछ लेना देना है नहीं।
I mean, for example, I counted up in your book, We Who Wrestle with God, a number of references to Cain. There are 356 references to Cain in the book, and 20 references to the descendants of Cain. You're obsessed with Cain because Cain is symbolic of evil. All the evil in the world, you more or less blame Cain for, and this is Cain. I mean, you don't believe Cain actually existed, I presume.
So यहाँ पे बाइबल की स्टोरी के बारे में बात हो रही है। केन और एबल एडम और ईव के बेटे थे, और केन जो है वो अपने ब्रदर को यानी कि एबल को मार देता है। और ऐसा समझा जाता है कि जितने भी सारे इविल लोग हुए हैं वो केन के डिसेंडेंट्स हैं। और पीटरसन के बुक में उन्होंने केन को बहुत ज़्यादा टाइम, आई थिंक उन्होंने काउंट बताया कि 300 से ज़्यादा बार उन्होंने रेफरेंस किया है। लेकिन डॉकिंस यहाँ पे बोल रहे हैं कि क्या केन एग्जिस्ट करता था, क्या केन सच में एक इंसान था, लाइक जीसस वाज अ ह्यूमन बीइंग? क्या वैसे केन एक इंसान था या फिर ये एक मिथोलॉजिकल फिगर है?
Well, I think of Cain as
Do you believe Cain existed?
I think the pattern that Cain represents is an eternal pattern, and so
yes,
it's a
that's
higher
different.
level of existence.
That's different. I realize
well, there
that.
are Cain types who exist, and they're
Yeah,
very well.
There are Cain types.
Yeah.
But Cain himself.
सो इसके बारे में हमने पहले भी बात करी हुई थी जब हमने लाइव रिएक्शन की थी जॉर्डन पीटरसन और एलेक्स ओकॉनर की वीडियो पे। उस इंटरव्यू में एलेक्स जॉर्डन पीटरसन को यही पूछता है कि क्या ये जो बाइबल की स्टोरीज है वो सच में हुई थी, क्या जीसस सच में रिजरेक्ट हुए थे? और पीटरसन उसका फिर घुमा फिरा के जवाब देता है। और इसी वजह से जेबी को क्रिटिसाइज किया जाता है कि वो चीजों का सही से सरलता से उत्तर नहीं देते। यहाँ पे क्वेश्चन सिंपल है कि क्या केन एग्जिस्ट करता था, लेकिन पीटरसन इस चीज का भी जवाब नहीं दे रहे हैं। वो बोल रहे कि केन टाइप्स एग्जिस्ट करते थे, ये मेटा नैरेटिव है, ये हमेशा से एग्जिस्ट करता आ रहा है, केन स्टिल एग्जिस्ट, ऐसी कुछ बातें वो बोलते हैं और इसी वजह से उनको सबसे ज्यादा क्रिटिसाइज किया जाता है।
I mean, you give the game away where you say in your book, Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born in the natural way. Now that betrays you as it were pretending you think they really existed, because you wouldn't have said they were born in a natural way unless you were muddling up facts with symbols there.
Well, I don't.
With symbols there, because you don't think that Cain and Abel existed.
Well, I don't. What do I think about Cain and Abel? I said I think the pattern that they represent always exists. Always exists.
You understand that that's a different thing.
Quite a different matter. A pattern that they represent, the conflict between brothers, the rivalry between brothers. This is a fundamental pattern, which yes, it's something that's there. But I care about facts. I mean, did they exist or did they not exist?
Well, I can imagine a situation where when the story was originated, that it referred to two actual brothers. But as the stories propagate across time, as they mutate, as they adapt, let's say, to to the structure of human memory, they deepen and they become broader. And so then they become emblematic not only of the pattern of conflict that might characterize the original two brothers that the story was about, but about the conflict between brothers as such, and then the more fundamental levels of conflict that exist within human beings, which is what you see in more sophisticated literature. It's like the biblical accounts speak of fact in a factual manner upon occasion, but the biblical accounts also speak poetically and metaphorically and allegorically, and people who are sophisticated in biblical analysis have known this for centuries. The biblical literalists generally suffer from the problem that they don't even know what it means to be literalist. There's lots of unsophisticated ways of approaching a text.
Okay, let's see what Professor
सो यहाँ पे जेपी का आर्गुमेंट ये है कि केन और एबल एक इटर्नल टाइप या फिर आर्कीटाइप्स के रूप में एग्जिस्ट करता है, और ये स्टोरी एक यूनिवर्सल स्टोरी है. इट्स अबाउट द कॉन्फ्लिक्ट बिटवीन ब्रदर्स, और चाहे वो केन और एबल हो या फिर हमारे डे टू डे लाइफ में ब्रदर्स हो, ये पैटर्न अक्रॉस कल्चर अक्रॉस टाइम एग्जिस्ट करता है. हो सकता है कि इनके पीछे कोई रियल इवेंट्स मौजूद हो, जैसे फिल्मों में होता है कि बेस्ड ऑन रियल इवेंट्स, वैसे ही हो सकता है कि बाइबल की जो स्टोरीज हो केन एंड एबल की, वो कुछ रियल इवेंट से प्रेरित हो. लेकिन वो स्टोरीज इसलिए इम्पोर्टेंट नहीं है कि वो सच थी या मिथोलॉजी थी. वो चीज़ें इसलिए इम्पोर्टेंट है क्योंकि वो जो पैटर्न है वो अभी भी एग्जिस्ट कर रहा है. अभी भी हमें भाइयों के बीच में झगड़ा देखने के लिए मिल रहा है. और डॉकिंस जो सवाल एम्फसाइज कर रहे हैं कि डिड केन एग्जिस्ट, ये सवाल इतना इम्पोर्टेंट है नहीं जॉर्डन पीटरसन के अकॉर्डिंग. उनके हिसाब से मॉरल और साइकोलॉजिकल ट्रूथ्स जो होते हैं वो कन्वे किए जाते हैं नैरेटिव से, और इसके लिए फैक्टिसिटी जरूरी नहीं होती. केन और एबल की स्टोरी हमें दिखाती है कि हमारा ह्यूमन नेचर कैसा है, फंडामेंटली हम ह्यूमंस कैसे हैं. जेपी बोलते हैं कि हर ह्यूमन रिलेशनशिप में एक साइकोलॉजिकल स्ट्रगल होता है, और ये स्टोरी उस साइकोलॉजिकल और मॉरल स्ट्रगल को दर्शाती है. ये स्टोरी जेलसी, एंगर, ग्रीड, सिन, इन सारी चीजों के बारे में बात करती है जो तभी भी एग्जिस्ट करते थे और वो आज भी एग्जिस्ट करते हैं.
Professor Dawkins thinks about that.
Well, I suppose I'm a literalist. I mean, and you give the game away when you say Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born in a natural way.
Well, I'm speaking allegorically there within the confines of the text. I mean, what I meant by that was that the way the story lays itself out is that Adam and Eve are created by God. And so they're not emblematic of the pattern of human beings that exist in fallen history. Within the confines of the text, the first two people who are genuine, who aren't creations of the divine, are Cain and Abel. And so for me, they're emblematic of the patterns of conflict that rip people apart in the world of history, in the world of normal history.
Professor Dawkins, I know you take particular umbrage with that statement that Cain and Abel were the first normally born human beings. But I think if I understand Dr. Peterson correctly, there are things that can be sort of true within a story. It's true that Sherlock Holmes lives at 221B Baker Street. And as far as I understand, that's maybe what you mean by the truth in the matter of Cain and Abel being the first naturally born humans. It's internal to the story. Well,
in the context of this story, they're the first two spirits or patterns you could think of, patterns of perception and action.
Yes.
That characterize human existence in the fallen world, right? So they're emblematic of what happens in history outside of the whatever is meant by the pre-existent paradise.
But at the same time, you must know, I know this comes up all of the time when somebody says, but did Cain and Abel really exist? And I know that you want to say that the story which
I think it's a silly question.
So Alex यहाँ पे ये चीज एक्नॉलेज कर रहा है कि ये चीज इंपॉर्टेंट है, ये नैरेटिव्स इंपॉर्टेंट है, ये चीजें हमें इटर्नल पैटर्न्स दिखाती है, ये हमारे इमोशंस को दर्शाती है. लेकिन सबसे फंडामेंटल क्वेश्चन ये आता है कि क्या केन और एबल सच में एग्जिस्ट करते थे?
I know that you want to say that the story which
I think it's a silly question. I think it's like asking whether Raskolnikov existed.
And in my opinion, it does not matter कि क्या केन और एबल एग्जिस्ट करते थे या नहीं. सो इसको हम इंडियन कॉन्टेक्स्ट में समझते हैं. अब बहुत सारे लोग ये आर्ग्यू करते हैं कि क्या महाभारत की स्टोरी सच में हुई थी या ये सिर्फ एक मिथ है. लेकिन डज इट रियली मैटर कि महाभारत की स्टोरी सच में हुई थी या ये सिर्फ एक कथा है? जब तुम महाभारत पढ़ते हो तो तुम्हें पता चलता है कि ह्यूमन मोटिव्स क्या होते हैं, ह्यूमन इमोशंस क्या होते हैं, और भी बहुत सारी चीजें तुम्हें महाभारत से सीखने के लिए मिलती है. महाभारत ने हमें गीता दी है. गीता का हिंदुइज्म में एक ऊंचा स्थान माना जाता है. तो क्वेश्चन आता है कि क्या महाभारत की स्टोरी इंपॉर्टेंट है? द आंसर इज यस. क्या गीता में इंपॉर्टेंट चीजें लिखी हुई है जो तुम्हें आज भी यूजफुल हो सकती है? द आंसर इज यस. लेकिन अगर कोई इस बात पे आर्ग्यू करने लग जाए कि महाभारत की स्टोरी सच में हुई थी या नहीं, सो दैट डज नॉट मैटर कि ये चीज सही में हुई थी या नहीं। और आई थिंक जेपी को ये बात पहले कहनी चाहिए थी कि दैट डज नॉट मैटर कि केन और एबल एग्जिस्ट करते थे या नहीं।
in Crime and Punishment. Like it's not a trivial question, because you can answer yes and you can answer no. You can say, well, there was no such specific person as Raskolnikov, but it's not a helpful question, because the reason that Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is a masterpiece is because Raskolnikov was everywhere in Russia when Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment. And so Raskolnikov is hyper real, not real.
But to be clear, is that how you feel about Cain and Abel? That is to say, an
I think
identifiable
they're hyper real.
Homo sapiens called Cain.
It's irrelevant.
Who murders his brother.
In a sense, it's irrelevant to me, because even if they were real, like, we don't know anything about them as
Well, of course they
historical
weren't real.
figures.
What's it, even if they weren't real? Of course they weren't real.
Well, like I said, it could have been the case that when the story originated, way back when it originated, that the first people that were described by the first person who generated the seeds of the Cain and Abel story were referring to actual people. But it doesn't matter, because the text has been compressed and modified over a vast span of time, and it's accreted all sorts of meanings that certainly weren't part and parcel of whatever the original story was.
Let's take the point Alex was making. Within the confines of the story, Dostoevsky was a great writer. What makes you think the writers of Genesis were a great writer? I mean, who were they? We know.
सो अगेन जेपी यहाँ पे हेजिटेट कर रहे हैं ये बोलने के लिए कि केन और एबल की स्टोरी सिर्फ एक स्टोरी है, और आई थिंक ये इसलिए है क्योंकि ये चीज सीधा ही रूट पे वार करती है। सवाल ये है कि अगर केन और एबल की स्टोरी रिलीजियस स्टोरी ना होती तो क्या वो स्टोरी इतनी फेमस होती, क्या इतने सारे लोग उस स्टोरी के बारे में बात करते हैं। सो यहाँ पे क्वेश्चन ये नहीं है कि सिर्फ केन और एबल की स्टोरी रियल है या नहीं, यहाँ पे पॉइंट ये है कि जब तुम किसी स्टोरी को रिलीजियस स्टोरी बताते हो तो बहुत सारे लोग मासेस में उसको फॉलो करते हैं, और वो चीज़ बहुत सारे लोगों को मीनिंग देती है। माना कि वो चीज़ यूजफुल है, हम उसके बारे में बात नहीं कर रहे हैं, लेकिन जब हम किसी स्टोरी को बोलते हैं कि ये भगवान की स्टोरी है या फिर रिलीजियस स्टोरी है, तब लोग उसके तरफ ज़्यादा अट्रैक्ट होते हैं। और जेपी यहाँ पे और एक क्लेम कर रहे हैं कि ये स्टोरी वक्त के साथ इवॉल्व होती चली गई। तो डॉकिंस यहाँ पे पूछ रहे हैं कि तुमने कौन से उसके वर्जन 1 वर्जन 2 ऐसे देखे हैं, और हमें ये तो ये पता नहीं कि ये स्टोरीज लिखी किसने थी, और तुम ये क्लेम नहीं कर सकते कि ये स्टोरीज इवॉल्व होती चली गई।
We know nothing about them.
Well, I think they were great writers, because I think I understand the patterning of the stories and what it points to. I think the idea, for example, that Cain and Abel are emblematic of two opposed patterns of adaptation to the world is brilliant. It's almost brilliant beyond imagining, especially because the story is so insanely compressed. And it's certainly evident to me as a clinician that the patterns that are portrayed in the story of Cain and Abel play themselves out in the real world continually and terribly.
You think the author of that story in Genesis was a literary genius?
I think that there's a spirit of literary genius at work across millennia, crafting that story so that it has almost an infinite depth. How that relates to the original author or sequential authors, I don't know, because it's lost in the seeds of time. It's lost in history.
So the story evolved. You're saying it's the story
like a meme.
Yes,
it
well,
evolved.
that's interesting.
It evolved to match the contours of the human memory. That's exactly it, is that these stories, that's part of their archetypal nature. Like, so they have.
So यहाँ पे जेपी उनकी बात डॉकिंस को उन्हीं के लैंग्वेज में एक्सप्लेन कर रहे हैं, क्योंकि उन्होंने ये चीज़ें घुमा फिरा के बोल ली। उन्होंने ये बोल लिया कि ये सिंबॉलिक है, ये मिथोलॉजी है, ये आर्कीटाइप्स है, और ये चीज़ें इंपॉर्टेंट है, लेकिन रिचर्ड डॉकिंस ये बातें समझ नहीं रहे हैं। सो यहाँ पे पीटरसन क्या कर रहे हैं कि उसी बात को वो डॉकिंस के लैंग्वेज में उन्हीं को समझा रहे हैं, और रिस्पॉन्स में बोलते हैं कि दिस इज इंटरेस्टिंग।
Have a emotional and motivational expression, but as they propagate across time, they also evolve, so they're maximally memorable, and they're maximally memorable for a biological reason.
Well, that's very interesting. If they really did evolve over time, if you could actually trace successive manuscripts, you can't do that. I mean, there's presumably a couple of Hebrew manuscripts and a Greek one. And I mean, what do you mean when you say it evolved?
Well, I would say you can see that in the compilation of the biblical texts, because one of the things that you see evolve, and you criticized the biblical text at one point, correct me if I've got this wrong, because I don't want to get this wrong. You said that there isn't anything in the biblical text that constitutes, let's say, significant original discovery, which is something that you'd expect if it was of divine providence, let's say, divine providence. And so, and I think, I was thinking about that objection, and I think that one of the discoveries that the text lays bare in an insanely brilliant manner is that the foundation of the community is sacrifice, that's an appropriate conceptualization. And you can see the concept of sacrifice evolve across the biblical texts as they're sequenced chronologically in the overall story that makes up the biblical text. The idea of sacrifice becomes more and more sophisticated. It's more and more elaborated. It's more and more specified. It's more and more embodied. There's an obvious progression in ideas.
The progression, where do you see that progression? In successive manuscripts? Or
It's in the successive stories as the text progresses. The way a novel progresses.
So something like sacrifice in the Old Testament. Sacrifice in the Old Testament.
No, through the
way through to the New Testament.
Text is a sacrificial story as well. The Passion story is a story of sacrifice.
It is
and
indeed.
The sacrificial motif recurs continually through the biblical text, and it's elaborated constantly. And
okay, so the criticism is the Bible as a text gives us nothing to indicate that it has divine origin. There's nothing that we can read in it.
Constantly. And
okay, so the criticism is the Bible as a text gives us nothing to indicate that it has divine origin. There's nothing that we can read in it where we think there's no way this idea could have evolved were it not divinely put into this text. That's a criticism that perhaps Professor Dawkins made in the past.
Well, I think it's reflective of some order that's so profound and implicit that there isn't a better way of describing it than divine. But I don't really care if we look at that from the bottom up, like as a biological phenomena, or as from the top down. I don't think it makes any difference.
It doesn't make a difference whether it was divinely inspired or whether it evolved within human.
I don't think look, so let me ask you this. Like, I think that at bottom, truth is unified. And what that's going to mean eventually is that the world of value and the world of fact coincide in some manner that we don't yet understand. And I think that union, the fact of that union and the fact of that union is equivalent to what's being described as divine order across millennia. There's no difference. Now, and this is a tricky business, because you either believe that the world of truth is unified in the final analysis, or you don't. Those are the options. And if it's not unified, then there's a disunity. There's a contradiction between value and fact, or there's a contradiction between different sets of values, and they can't be brought into unity. I don't believe that.
Well, let's go back to what
यहाँ पे जेपी बोलना चाह रहे हैं कि फैक्चुअल रियलिटीज और वैल्यू जजमेंट्स, ये दोनों चीज़ें इंटरट्वाइंड होती है, ये एक दूसरे के साथ जुड़ी हुई होती है, और जो कि हम फैक्ट्स को ऑब्जेक्टिवली वेरीफाई कर सकते हैं। हम वैल्यूज को, मॉरलिटी को, या फिर जो चीज़ें हम इम्पोर्टेंट समझते हैं उन चीज़ों को फैक्चुअली वेरीफाई नहीं कर सकते। फॉर एग्जाम्पल, जब हम कोई चीज़ डिसाइड करते हैं, लेट्स से हमें डिसाइड करना है कि हमें साइंटिफिक रिसर्च प्रायोरिटाइज करना है या फिर कोई सोशल इशू है, और पीटरसन बोलते हैं कि ये चीज़ सिर्फ फैक्ट से इन्फ्लुएंस नहीं होती, ये इन्फ्लुएंस होती है हमारे अंडरलाइंग बिलीफ से। इसलिए फैक्ट और वैल्यू का रिलेशनशिप समझना हमारे लिए इम्पोर्टेंट हो जाता है। फैक्ट्स को अक्सर ऐसा देखा जाता है कि फैक्ट्स आर ऑब्जेक्टिव, लेकिन पीटरसन बोलते हैं कि जब हम इन फैक्ट्स को परसीव करते हैं और इंटरप्रेट करते हैं, तब उस चीज़ में सब्जेक्टिविटी आ जाती है। हमारी वैल्यूज़ क्या है, हम किस चीज़ को ज़्यादा इंपॉर्टेंस देते हैं, ये डिपेंड करता है कि हमारी प्रायोरिटीज़ क्या होगी। हमारी वैल्यूज़ हमारा ये डिसीजन शेप करती है कि हम किन चीज़ों को इम्पोर्टेंट मानते हैं और किन चीज़ों को लेस इम्पोर्टेंट मानते हैं या फिर इग्नोर करते हैं। और ये चीज़ इस चीज़ के ऊपर असर डालती है कि हम इंफॉर्मेशन कैसे गैदर करते हैं और हम उस इंफॉर्मेशन को समझते कैसे हैं।
What you said earlier, which I was very interested in, you implied there's no difference between whether the text is divinely inspired or whether it evolved in progression during a series of manuscripts, presumably. Now, I think that's genuinely interesting, but it's a huge difference. It's not the same thing. I mean, either it was divinely inspired or it wasn't.
Well, it's the same thing if it's fundamentally reflective of and accurately reflective of the implicit logos or order. And I think it is. Like, let me explain that a moment. Like, it took me a long time to understand the concept of sacrifice in the biblical text, because it seems so anachronistic and so primitive, and primitive and not understandable. What are these people doing, offering, choice cuts of meat to a God that lives in the sky?
Something disgusting about it.
Well, it's very easy to satirize, but when you start to understand that perception itself is sacrificial in its nature, and you start to understand that there's no difference between work and sacrifice, that they're the same thing, and you understand that community is predicated on sacrifice, then the emphasis in the text on sacrifice starts to become something quite marked and remarkable, especially because it's implicit. It isn't obvious at all that the authors of the texts and the editors who sequenced them actually understood what it was that they were highlighting. So with regards to the community, why is the community predicated on sacrifice? Because it's not about you, the community. Every step you take towards the communitarian means that you sacrifice something that's local to what you want here and now, right now.
I think
you have to give something up.
You're wandering onto some.
यहाँ पे जेपी बोल रहे हैं कि जो बाइबल में सैक्रिफाइस के बारे में बोला गया है दैट इज नॉट प्रिमेटिव, ये आउटडेटेड कॉन्सेप्ट नहीं है। और एट फर्स्ट ग्लांस अगर हम देखें तो हमें लग सकता है कि ये कुछ प्रिमेटिव चीज़ है, ये कुछ एनिमलिस्टिक चीज़ है, लेकिन वो बोलते हैं कि सैक्रिफाइस इज फंडामेंटल एस्पेक्ट ऑफ ह्यूमन एग्जिस्टेंस, और ये सैक्रिफाइस इसेंशियल होता है फॉर द फॉर्मेशन एंड मेंटेनेंस ऑफ एनी कम्युनिटी। जब हम किसी कम्युनिटी का हिस्सा होते हैं तब ये सैक्रिफाइस इंपॉर्टेंट रोल प्ले करता है। हमें खुद के ऊपर उस सोसाइटी को रखना होता है, हमें खुद के ऊपर बाकी लोगों को रखना होता है अगर हम उस सोसाइटी में रह रहे हैं तो। जब हिंदुइज्म में भी हम यज्ञ की बात करते हैं तो व्हाट इज यज्ञ? यज्ञ इज नथिंग बट अ सैक्रिफाइस। हम कुछ चीज़ें यज्ञ में स्वाहा करके सैक्रिफाइस करते हैं, और ये एक सिंबॉलिक चीज़ है। ये हमें दर्शाती कि हमें लाइफ में हर चीज़ के लिए सैक्रिफाइस करना ज़रूरी है, और ये चीज़ डिफरेंट कल्चर्स में हमें अलग अलग तरीके से देखने के लिए मिलती है।
Something else now, which is something quite different. The notion of sacrifice, as you say, it goes right through the Old Testament and the New Testament. The sacrifice of Isaac or Ishmael by Abraham and the sacrifice of Jesus is the same idea. I think it's a very unpleasant idea, by the way. But what are you actually saying? Are you saying that Abraham did or did not sacrifice Isaac? Are you saying that Jesus really did die for our sins? I mean, do you believe that? Do you believe that as a fact, that Jesus died for our sins?
So, घुमा फिरा के बात यही पे आ जा रही है कि ये चीज़ें फैक्चुअल थी कि नहीं थी। यहाँ पे पीटरसन बात कर रहे हैं सैक्रिफाइस के बारे में, डीप मीनिंग के बारे में, सिंबोलिज्म के बारे में, मिथोलॉजी के बारे में, और रिचर्ड डॉकिंस एक ही चीज़ पे अड़े हुए हैं कि ये चीज़ फैक्चुअल है या नहीं। इनके जो अकॉम्प्लिशमेंट्स है मैं उनको डाउन प्ले नहीं करना चाहता, लेकिन इस कॉन्वर्सेशन में हमें ये दिख रहा है कि ये कितने क्लोज माइंडेड है। यहाँ पे पीटरसन 10 चीज़ों के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं और डॉकिंस सिर्फ एक चीज़ पे अड़े हुए हैं कि क्या ये चीज़ फैक्चुअल है या नहीं है।
Texts that I don't claim to understand. What my experience has been that the more deeply I look into these texts, the more I learn. That doesn't mean that I can proclaim full knowledge of what the texts proclaim. But I don't think, and I'm not trying to play a trick here. You know, I watched an interview that you did recently where you were talking, I think it was with Piers Morgan, yeah, about the complexities of trying to understand this strange realm of quantum phenomena, right? And we have a trouble with quantum phenomena because at the micro level, things don't act like things act at the macro level. So they escape our intuitions. And one of the things you said was that although it's perhaps even impossible for creatures embodied like us to get a grip on quantum phenomena, the strange wave-particle duality, for example, we have ample evidence that it works and stellarly. And I would say exactly the same thing about the biblical texts. If they run into a mystery, like there's a horizon of mystery, which I do not claim to penetrate, but insofar as I've been able to understand the texts, every time I make a improvement in understanding, it reveals something to me that's just like shattering.
So in short ये बोलना चाह रहे हैं कि बिब्लिकल टेक्स्ट को हम पूरी तरीके से समझ नहीं सकते, जस्ट लाइक क्वांटम फिजिक्स, जैसे हम पार्टिकल्स के क्वांटम नेचर को नहीं समझ सकते, वैसे ही हम बाइबल की कुछ स्टोरीज को नहीं समझ सकते। इट्स स्टिल अ मिस्ट्री, लेकिन इसका मतलब ये नहीं कि ये चीजें इंपॉर्टेंट नहीं है।
Physics is deeply mysterious, and you're saying that biblical texts are deeply mysterious. The difference is quantum physics, the predictions you derive from quantum physics, are fulfilled to the umpteenth decimal place. The umpteenth decimal place, I mean, I think it was Richard Feynman says, equivalent to predicting the width of North America to the nearest hair's breadth. And
Right.
that's impressive. That's
No doubt.
the mystery there, as it were, gains its credentials by its predictions. The mysteries of the Bible don't have any credentials at all, as far as I can make out.
Well, I guess the credentials that I would put, you made a statement a couple of months ago that I found very interesting. And I don't claim to understand it, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot with it. You said that you were a cultural Christian. Okay, and so that raised a number of questions in my mind, you know, and the first question was,
You are changing the subject.
no, I'm not. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I may be leaping outside of the topic a bit to
We
get
can
back
do
to it.
cultural Christianity, but I think 'cause I have a list of questions that you wanted to ask, and that is one of them. But I think Professor Dawkins did ask
were
you.
referring to the predictive power and to the
Of
utility of the
quantum, yeah,
stories.
yeah.
Okay, so that's actually what I was trying to
Okay,
zero in
fine.
on.
Go ahead.
Okay, so that was the point. Well, it seemed to me that your proclamation that you were a cultural Christian was a recognition and a statement that you had found something in the culture that had been derived from Christianity that you had an affinity with, and that there's some reason for that. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, well, what do you think that Christianity got right that allows you to make a statement like that? I mean, I know that there's differences perhaps in what we both think about the ultimate veracity of the biblical stories. Maybe there isn't differences. Like, it would take a lot of conversation to figure this out. But what did you mean by that? Like, what do you think that Christianity got right that would enable you to make a statement like that?
Virtually nothing.
सो कुछ महीने पहले रिचर्ड डॉकिंस ने बोला था कि ही इज कल्चरल क्रिश्चियन, और उस इंटरव्यू में उन्होंने क्रिश्चियनिटी के बारे में कई अच्छी बातें भी बोली थी। और यहाँ पे वो बोल रहे हैं कि वर्चुअली नथिंग, मतलब वो क्रिश्चियनिटी को यहाँ पे डाउन प्ले कर रहे हैं, जबकि उस इंटरव्यू में उन्होंने क्रिश्चियनिटी के बारे में कई अच्छी बातें बोली थी।
Call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. And so, you know, I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country, but I would not be happy if, for example, we lost all our cathedrals and our beautiful parish churches. So I count myself a cultural Christian. I think it would matter if we substituted any alternative religion. That would be truly dreadful. If I had to choose between Christianity and Islam, I choose Christianity every single time. I mean, it seems to me to be a fundamentally decent religion. I find that I like to live in a culturally Christian country, although I do not believe a single word of the Christian faith.
और ये चीजें तब होती है जब डिबेट सिर्फ जीतने के लिए की जाती है, यहाँ पे आइडियाज का कोई एक्सचेंज नहीं होता। इन माई ओपिनियन, आई कुड बी रॉन्ग हियर, बट व्हाट आई से इज डॉकिंस सिर्फ जीतने के लिए डिबेट कर रहे हैं। पीटरसन जो बात उन्हें कन्वे करना चाह रहे हैं, वो चीज वो समझने की कोशिश नहीं कर रहे हैं। ही जस्ट ट्राइंग टू विन दिस डिबेट, दैट्स इट।
Meant by that, no more than that I'm brought up in a Christian culture. I went to Christian schools. I therefore know my way around the Bible. I know my way around the Book of Common Prayer. I know the hymns. That's all. I don't value Christianity as a truth system at all.
Okay, so let me ask you about that, because maybe that's true and perhaps it's not. So the first question is, like, do you think that there are any marked differences between cultural traditions that would enable you to rank order them in terms of their ethical validity?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so for example, we could contrast mainstream UK Christianity with Islamic fundamentalism.
Yes.
Okay, so there's...
सो पीटरसन यहाँ पे आ रहा है गॉड के ऊपर। पीटरसन जिस चीज को गॉड मानते हैं, वो चीज है वैल्यू हायरार्की में जो सबसे टॉप वाली चीज है, उस चीज को पीटरसन गॉड बोलते हैं। और इस सवाल से ये यही पे आ रहा है। इसे फिर से एक बार सुनते हैं हम।
a hierarchy in terms of their differences between. Question is, like, do you think that there are any marked differences between cultural traditions that would enable you to rank order them in terms of their ethical validity?
Yes, I do.
सो इनका क्वेश्चन है कि किसी भी कल्चर में जो ट्रेडिशंस होते हैं, जो मॉरल्स होते हैं, क्या तुम उनको हायरार्किकली अरेंज कर सकते हो? क्या तुम बोल सकते हो कि ये चीज दूसरी चीज से बेटर है? और इस चीज का जवाब डॉकिंस पॉजिटिव में देता है।
Okay, so for example, we could contrast mainstream UK Christianity with Islamic fundamentalism.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a hierarchy.
There is a hierarchy.
Okay, a hierarchy that points to what?
सो अगर तुम बोल रहे हो कि एक चीज दूसरी चीज से ऊपर है तो सबसे टॉप में कौन सी चीज है, सबसे टॉप में क्या है, जिस चीज के ओर तुम पॉइंट कर रहे हो या जिस चीज के ओर तुम जाने की कोशिश कर रहे हो वो चीज क्या है? फॉर पीटरसन दैट थिंग इज गॉड.
Well, in the case of Islam, I dislike any religion which punishes apostasy with death, that throws gay people off high buildings, that practices clitoridectomy. That seems to me to place Islam on a lower level than Christianity, but that's not to say anything very positive about Christianity.
Well,
सो इस चीज पे डॉकिंस का आर्गुमेंट ये है कि ए रिलीजन में अगर कुछ खामियां है और वो खामियां बी रिलीजन में नहीं है तो बी सुपीरियर नहीं हो जाता, सिर्फ ए रिलीजन इंफीरियर हो जाता है.
it might be to say something positive about Christianity. Like, I think that question is open because you might ask yourself, what did Christianity get right that led it away from those particular presumptions and towards something that you regard as more ethically appropriate? Like, this isn't a trivial question.
It's a very modest claim. There's not very much. I mean, to be better than a religion that throws gay people off high buildings is not really a very virtuous achievement.
सो इट्स लाइक कि जब इंडिया में लोग बोलते हैं कि हम पाकिस्तान से बेटर है तो इसका काउंटर ये होता है कि इट्स नॉट दैट मच ऑफ एन अचीवमेंट कि जब तुम पाकिस्तान को इंडिया से कंपेयर कर रहे हो जबकि उनकी हालत बहुत ज़्यादा खस्ता है. सो डॉकिंस का भी यही क्लेम है, अगर तुम किसी फंडामेंटलिस्ट रिलीजन को क्रिश्चियनिटी से कंपेयर कर रहे हो ये कुछ बहुत बढ़िया बात नहीं है, ये कुछ बहुत अच्छी बात नहीं है.
I don't know. I don't know if that's true because if you look at the barbarism that characterizes the human past, you might think that any progression whatsoever towards something approximating mercy and tolerance is nothing short of a bloody miracle.
Well,
Like, people are pretty ruthless, and so are our chimpanzee cousins.
yes, they are.
Right. So
Yes.
so we move forward into the light with great difficulty. And
yes.
the fact that we can take that for granted now and that it seems self-evident and deserving of faint praise, it's not so clear to me that that's a reasonable proposition.
Okay, let's grant the faint praise, but that has nothing to do with the truth value. And what I care about is the truth value. I see no truth value in the claims of Christianity, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the miracles. Do you believe in any of those?
सो घुमा फिरा के फिर से एक बार डॉकिंस इसी पे आ गए कि बाइबल में ये चीज जो लिखी गई थी वो सही है या गलत है. एंड इट्स काइंड ऑफ फ्रस्ट्रेटिंग टू सी कि कोई इतना बड़ा साइंटिस्ट सिर्फ एक बात पे अड़ा हुआ है. हम 32वें मिनट पे हैं, हम हाफ एन आवर का कॉन्वर्सेशन ऑलरेडी सुन चुके हैं और डॉकिंस इस सवाल के आगे नहीं जा रहे कि ये चीज सही थी या गलत थी. ऑन द अदर हैंड पीटरसन भी इस चीज का जवाब ठीक से दे नहीं रहे हैं, वो भी जलेबे की तरह चीजों को घुमा फिरा के बोल रहे हैं. लेकिन उन्होंने एक तरीके से इस चीज का जवाब दे दिया है कि इट डज नॉट मैटर कि ये चीज सही में हुई थी या नहीं हुई थी. सो इससे पहले केन और एबल के बारे में डिस्कशन हो चुका था कि ये सच में एग्जिस्ट करते थे या नहीं, और वो डिबेट हो जाने के बाद ये फिर से अब वर्जिन मैरी पे आ गए हैं कि मैरी सचमुच वर्जिन थी या नहीं थी.
Do you believe Jesus was born a virgin?
As I said before, there are elements of the text that I don't feel qualified to comment on. My experience has been that the more, I know from a metaphorical perspective and from a mythic perspective what the story of the virgin birth means, and I accept that. I know, for example, that any culture that doesn't hold the image of the woman and infant sacred dies.
Do you mean
And I don't know how that needs to be expressed in a
Is
form
it true, though?
Do you mean that you don't know?
well,
एलेक्स बहुत बढ़िया काम कर रहा है यहाँ पे मीडिएट करने का. वो बोल रहा है यू मीन यू डोंट नो.
let me ask you about that because truth, this is something I talked with Sam Harris about too. Truth, as we know, is a tricky business. Do you think there are differences in the truth claims between different writers of fiction? Like, is Dostoevsky more profound than...
No, well, I wouldn't call fiction truth claims anyway. I mean,
Well,
these are...
Then on what grounds do we rank order the fiction in terms of quality? Like, Dostoevsky is a profound purveyor of fiction on the philosophical front, unbelievably deep and profound.
Yes,
There's something true about what he's writing about.
It's nothing to do with the truth that science is concerned with. The truth of science is the truth that gets us to the moon. I mean, this is nothing to do with whether one writer of fiction has a sort of insight into human nature. That goes without saying. I accept that.
Okay, so how do we deal with the notion that on the purely factual side, how do we deal with the idea? Let's take you talked about clitoridectomy. Let's talk about the oppression of women.
Yes.
We make a scientific case that that's inappropriate, or is it a case that we're making on some other grounds? Like I see in the Judeo-Christian tradition, one of the earliest pronouncements is that both men and women carry the image of God, both. And that sets a certain tone to everything that follows. And it is a remarkable proclamation given.
सो पीटरसन यहाँ पे ये इम्प्लाई करना चाह रहे हैं कि बाइबल कहीं ना कहीं इक्वालिटी को प्रमोट कर रहा है। यहाँ पे बोथ मेन और वीमेन को गॉड की तरह ट्रीट किया जा रहा है। बोथ मेन एंड वीमेन को इक्वल इम्पोर्टेंस दी जा रही है और ये कहीं ना कहीं एक प्रोग्रेसिव बात है। और उस जमाने के लिए, जिस जमाने में बाइबल लिखा गया था हजारों सालों पहले, उस जमाने के लिए ये बहुत ज्यादा प्रोग्रेसिव बात थी।
It's radical age that both men and women are carry the image of God and are to be treated as something with intrinsic value outside of the domain of power and politics. And it isn't obvious to me, having thought about this a lot, how we deal with that in the pure realm of fact. Because one of the facts is, if I can oppress you, why the hell shouldn't I?
Yeah, my job is to keep things on track here. I think there are a number of
Yeah.
questions which Professor Dawkins has asked quite directly
Yeah.
that we still haven't really heard an answer for.
Okay.
When Professor Dawkins asking about the virgin birth, you started talking about metaphor, you started talking about myth. I think anybody listening to this conversation will understand that maybe a society that doesn't believe in the virgin birth won't work. Maybe that's the predictive power that you're talking about. But I think you must understand that when Professor Dawkins is asking you, do you believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? He means something like a biological fact. And by the way, saying I don't know, or saying, I'm not qualified to comment, is an answer to that question. But is that your answer, that you don't know?
I said earlier, and I
ये अभी भी इसी चीज पे अटके हुए हैं। डॉकिंस इनको पूछ रहे हैं कि ये चीज सच में हुई थी या नहीं हुई थी, और पीटरसन भी इसका जवाब ठीक से दे नहीं रहे।
I would hold
Answer to that question, but is that your answer, that you don't know?
I said earlier, and I would hold to this, is that there are elements of the text that I don't know how to, that I'm incapable of fully accounting for. I can't account for what the fundamental reality and significance of the notion of the resurrection is. My knowledge just ends.
Sure, but
I know that whatever happened as a consequence of the origination and the promotion of the Christian story was powerful enough to bring Rome to its knees and demolish the pagan enterprise. So there's some power in that story that's remarkable.
Let's stick to the virgin birth.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, well, the virgin birth results from a mistranslation of Isaiah. You know that.
Like these sorts of questions, what would you say? They don't strike me as, they're not getting to the point.
I know
The
that. I
story
know
has
you
a
think
purpose.
that. Yes.
Well, and look, I understand that there's perfect reasons to debate this. I know that, and I know that your question is more than valid, but it's beside the issue as far as I'm concerned, and it's partly because, well, when we started this conversation, I said, for example, that it appears to be the case that a description of the structure through which we see the world is a story. We see the world through a story, and so. That's a remarkable thing. That's a remarkable discovery, and it's emerged probably in the last 60 years in multiple disciplines, because we have to prioritize our facts. And so we prioritize them according to a particular pattern. And there are patterns that seem to work and to propagate themselves properly and to orient cultures towards life abundant. And there are other patterns, the pattern of Cain, for example, that lead to absolute bloody devastation. And I don't know exactly how to construe that sort of truth, but we talked about the oppression of women, for example. It's like, how do you make a case on purely factual grounds that women should be treated as equals?
It's a moral question, and
I know that's exactly.
यहाँ पे पीटरसन ने पकड़ लिया। अब तक डॉकिंस बात कर रहे थे फैक्ट्स के बारे में। वो हर चीज को लेके आ रहे थे फैक्ट्स के ऊपर। ये चीज फैक्चुअल नहीं है, ये चीज असल में हुई थी या नहीं हुई थी, ये चीज फैक्चुअल नहीं है, इसलिए मैं इस चीज को नहीं मानूंगा। अब पीटरसन इनको पूछ रहे हैं कि मेन और वीमेन को अगर तुम इक्वली ट्रीट कर रहे हो तो क्या ये फैक्चुअल आर्गुमेंट है? तो तुम इस चीज को फैक्चुअली कैसे प्रूव कर सकते हो? अब द फैक्ट इज मेन एंड वीमेन शुड बी ट्रीटेड एज इक्वल इज नॉट अ फैक्चुअल आर्गुमेंट, क्योंकि ये मॉरलिटी के रेल में आ जाता है। वैसे ही जो पीटरसन बात कर रहे थे बाइबल के बारे में, उनकी स्टोरीज के बारे में, नैरेटिव्स के बारे में, वो चीज सिंबॉलिक है। जस्ट लाइक तुम किसी को इक्वली ट्रीट करना है, ये चीज फैक्ट से पता नहीं लगा सकते, ये चीज मॉरलिटी के बारे में है। वैसे ही अगर तुम बोल रहे हो कि इस स्टोरी का ये मतलब होता है और ये चीज इंपॉर्टेंट है, तो वहां पे फैक्ट्स की बात नहीं हो रही है.
I was dealing with a factual question, which is, did Jesus have a father? And you won't answer it.
Well,
It's a
Jesus
different
had an
kind of
earthly
question.
father and a heavenly father, like almost all mythological heroes.
So he wasn't born of a virgin then? So you're saying that Jesus was not born of a virgin?
I said, first of all, that I don't know how to mediate the fact-value dichotomy in that case. I said the same thing about the resurrection.
It's not a value. It's a simple fact. I mean, did a man have intercourse with Mary and produce Jesus? That's a factual question.
He just can say कि ये नहीं हुआ था, लेकिन ये इम्पोर्टेंट है. ये इतना सिंपल क्वेश्चन है कि पीटरसन ये बोल सकते हैं कि ये प्रैक्टिकली पॉसिबल नहीं है, लेकिन दिस इज इम्पोर्टेंट. लेकिन ये बात को जलेबी की तरह घुमा के बोल रहे हैं. ये पॉइंट पे नहीं आ रहा है.
It's not a value question.
You must understand what you're being asked here. That even if you think that, say, the author of the biblical texts intended much more significance than a simple scientific analysis of events, Professor Dawkins is interested in scientific truth. That's the kind of truth that he's interested in. And even if you think it's irrelevant to the point of what the gospel authors were getting at, that first needs to be clarified before you can then begin actually uncovering what the stories are about. So I think Professor Dawkins is asking from a scientific perspective. And maybe you think that that scientific approach is wrong. But if you just take it for a moment, maybe this is how we find out that it is wrong. Let's take a scientific approach. Ask the question, did this occur?
I think
भाई ये बहुत बढ़िया काम कर रहा है मीडिएट करने का. मतलब the way he's articulating that argument respectfully without offending anyone is commendable. And he's just 24. 24 साल की उम्र में इन बिगेस के सामने बैठ के तुम सही क्वेश्चन पूछ पा रहे हो उनको. एंड समटाइम्स आई थिंक कि इसके पास जो आर्टिकुलेशन स्किल्स है वो 0.1% भी मेरे पास होती तो भाई मैं कहाँ पहुंच जाता. एंड इन माई ओपिनियन ही इज द बेस्ट मैन टू मीडिएट दिस कॉन्वर्सेशन, क्योंकि एलेक्स ने दोनों के साथ इंटरव्यू किया हुआ है और उसने हार्ड क्वेश्चंस पूछे हैं. जो क्वेश्चन रिचर्ड डॉकिंस पीटरसन को पूछ रहे हैं वो ऑलरेडी ये क्वेश्चन पीटरसन को पूछ चुका है कि क्या बिब्लिकल स्टोरी सच में हुई थी, क्या वर्जिन मैरी ने सच में जीसस को बर्थ दिया था. ये सारी चीजें वो ऑलरेडी पूछ चुका है पीटरसन से. एंड ही इज नॉट अफ्रेड टू आस्क डिफिकल्ट क्वेश्चंस. अगर कोई दूसरा यहाँ पे होता तो आई डोंट थिंक वो इतनी बेबाकी से ये क्वेश्चंस पूछ पाता इनसे.
that it's inappropriate to use a question like that to attempt to undermine the validity of the entire, what would you say, deep mythological enterprise.
Well, suppose we weren't doing that. Suppose we were asking out of interest. Suppose that we were all here devout Christians, maybe even Jungian Christians, and we thought, this is interesting, over dinner. Do you think it really happened, like scientifically? Would your answer just be, I don't know?
Yes.
And you wouldn't consider it, I mean, it's not an inappropriate question to ask, just on a point of interest.
Right.
Did this really occur? And I think so often people are asking you that, and especially given the context of this conversation, we've heard everything that you're saying about metaphor and myth, but because the question is still then being asked, did it really happen? You know that that's what you're being asked. And the way you just so easily said yes, I wonder why you struggle to do that in so many other circumstances.
I think because I don't look at the situation the same.
ये पूछ रहा है कि अगर तुम इतने आसानी से इस सवाल का जवाब दे सकते थे तो आप हेजिटेट क्यों कर रहे थे? आपने इतना टाइम क्यों लिया यस नो या फिर आई डोंट नो बोलने के लिए?
The way that Dr. Dawkins and I look at the situation are really quite different and at many levels. You know, so even on the meme question, for example, you know, like I know the literature on the history of religious ideas. I see how these ideas have battled across millennia in a manner that is very reminiscent to me of the same sort of claim that Dr. Dawkins is putting forward with regards to meme. I know that literature. Dr. Dawkins doesn't know that literature. And it's very difficult for me to communicate from within the confines of that literature because it's extensive and deep. And we're dealing with things that we don't understand the relationship between
So JP बोल रहे हैं कि उन्होंने ये लिटरेचर पढ़ा है, उन्होंने मीम्स के बारे में पढ़ा है, उन्होंने आर्केटाइप्स के बारे में पढ़ा है, लेकिन डॉकिंस ने आर्केटाइप के बारे में नहीं पढ़ा. एंड आई डोंट इवन डिसएग्री विद दिस, क्योंकि जिस तरीके से हम देख पा रहे हैं कि रिचर्ड डॉकिंस इतने क्लोज माइंडेड हो रहे हैं इस कॉन्वर्सेशन में, वी सी कि उन्होंने इस बारे में ज़्यादा कुछ पढ़ा नहीं है या फिर वो सिंबोलिज्म या मिथोलॉजी के बारे में ज़्यादा कुछ जानना नहीं चाहते.
metaphoric truth and value predicated truth, and understand the relationship between metaphoric truth and value predicated truth and factual truth. We don't understand that. It's a big problem. We cannot, there's no evidence whatsoever from the scientific perspective that we can orient ourselves in the world merely in consequence of the facts.
Sure.
And that's a fact. And it's a fact that's been detailed out in great detail in the last 60 years. by people from a variety of different disciplines. We have to prioritize the facts. That's a value hierarchy. There may be true and false ways of prioritizing facts, but you can't determine the truth or falsehood of the way that you prioritize facts
Yes.
by making reference to the facts. That's a big problem.
Okay, let's talk about.
सो जेपी आप ये बोल रहे हैं कि ट्रूथ सिर्फ एक टाइप का नहीं होता, देयर आर डिफरेंट फॉर्म्स ऑफ ट्रूथ. एक मेटाफोरिकल ट्रूथ होता है जो चीजें हम मेटाफोर्स के रूप में समझते हैं, हिंदी में उसे रूपक अलंकार बोलते हैं. देयर आर डिफरेंट थ्योरीज ऑफ ट्रूथ. एक होता है करस्पॉन्डेंट ट्रूथ, एक होता है कोहेरेंट ट्रूथ, एक होता है प्रैग्मेटिक ट्रूथ. प्रैग्मेटिक ट्रूथ मतलब जो चीजें प्रैक्टिकल है उसे बोलते हैं प्रैग्मेटिक ट्रूथ. कोहेरेंट थ्योरी ऑफ ट्रूथ बोलते हैं कि वही चीजें ट्रू होती हैं जो बाकी चीजों के साथ कोहेरेंट होती है. और करस्पॉन्डेंट ट्रूथ मतलब जो हम समझते हैं कि जो चीजें सच है. अगर रास्ते पे कोई व्हाइट शर्ट पहना हुआ आदमी खड़ा है और मैं बोलता हूँ कि इस रास्ते पे व्हाइट शर्ट पहना हुआ आदमी खड़ा है, दैट इज ट्रूथ. ये होता है करस्पॉन्डेंट ट्रूथ. और डॉकिंस यहाँ पे सिर्फ करस्पॉन्डेंट ट्रूथ के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं. ही इज इग्नोरिंग द मेटाफोरिकल ट्रूथ, प्रैग्मेटिक ट्रूथ, कोहेरेंट ट्रूथ.
About that as perhaps a slight detour here, because I think we do need to come back to this Christ resurrection thing. But Professor Dawkins, would you say that underlying the scientific enterprise is a fundamentally unscientific assumption? You can make scientific investigations in the world, but in order to do so, you need to choose what to prioritize. You need to choose what to investigate. You also need to value the truth. You need to have a value and a motivation for doing it in the first place. Those kinds of things cannot themselves be scientifically justified. And so does the scientific enterprise have an unscientific assumption into space?
I suppose it does. I mean, I think that maybe just be Jordan and Richard, by the way. I think that Jordan prioritizes myth and I prioritize fact. And I think myth is kind of vaguely interesting, but it's not the be-all and end-all of my life. I think it's somewhat secondary to scientific fact, the sort of facts that tell us how old the universe is, how old the world is, the history of life, the engineering achievements of landing a spacecraft on a comet. These are the things that science can do. And as I said, the predictions of quantum theory, to come back to that, the predictions of quantum theory, which are verified to a sufficient number of decimal places that it's equivalent to predicting the width of North America to one hair's breadth. Now, that is, however difficult quantum theory is to understand, that is what you can get from quantum theory. Now, the mysteries of the Bible, if they are mysteries, aren't in the same league. I mean, they just don't cut it.
तो यहाँ पे यही बोलना चाह रहे हैं कि बाइबल में जो चीज़ें लिखी हुई है या फिर रिलीजियस स्क्रिप्चर्स में जो चीज़ें लिखी हुई होती वो इतनी ज़्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट नहीं होती जितना कि साइंटिफिक फैक्ट्स इम्पोर्टेंट होता है. उन्होंने चीज़ें गिनाई कि साइंस से ये होता है, तो उनके हिसाब से ये चीज़ें ज़्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट है ओवर बाइबल या फिर कोई भी रिलीजियस टेक्स्ट.
So one of the things that I've tried to study is the preconditions for the scientific enterprise itself. You appeared to agree with Alex that there might be presumptions, axioms that need to be accepted. I don't want to put words in your mouth because I want to get this right before the scientific enterprise can begin. So I've tried to think those through. So let me lay out a couple of them. This is partly what I've done while trying to make the case, for example, that you're more of a Christian than you think you are. So, for example, I think that the scientific enterprise is motivated by the axiomatic presumption that truth tends towards a unity. I think that it's predicated on the notion that there is a logical order that's intrinsic to the cosmos, that fundamental order is good, that it's intelligible to human beings, and that discovering that order and aligning ourselves with it makes for life more abundant. I think that the scientific enterprise is also predicated on the idea that the truth will set you free. And I think all of those axioms are religious and derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And if you don't believe that, you have to account for why science emerged in Europe and nowhere else in the entire history of humanity, for example, and why it's under assault from like all quarters now as that underlying metaphysic disappears. Like you haven't had to be concerned with the mythological substrate in your lifetime in some sense because it was intact.
Yeah.
And so the universities could flourish and you had your freedom, remarkable freedom to pursue your scientific enterprise wherever you wanted. And people lauded you for it. Like that time is threatened and seriously so. And I think it's partly because these metaphysical assumptions have now become questionable, and that's part of the reason that I'm attending to them. It's not because I don't admire the accuracy of quantum prediction, for example, or celebrate what Musk is doing with his capability of sending rockets to Mars. It's like more power to the technological enterprise. But you know what's happening in the universities? It's awful. And that's not a scientific problem. It's okay.
I agree about that.
सो यहाँ पे जेपी ने बहुत सारी चीज़ों के बारे में बात की. सो वो बोलते हैं यूनिटी ऑफ ट्रूथ. सो व्हाट ही मीन्स बाय यूनिटी ऑफ ट्रूथ इज देयर इज एन अजम्पशन दैट ट्रूथ टेंड्स टुवर्ड्स यूनिटी. मतलब सच यूनिटी की ओर जाता है. मतलब तुम जितने भी सारे साइंटिफिक मेथड, साइंटिफिक ट्रूथ, फैक्ट्स इकट्ठा करते हो तो वो सारे तुम्हें एक ही तरफ लेके जाते हैं, और वो सारे पीसेस फिट लाइक अ जिक्सॉ पजल. देन जेपी बात करते हैं एक इंट्रिंसिक ऑर्डर के बारे में. सो जेपी इस बारे में बात कर रहे हैं कि इस कॉस्मोस की कोई एक लॉजिकल ऑर्डर है एंड दैट ऑर्डर इज गुड, लेकिन वो हमें पता नहीं है, हम उस चीज को पता नहीं लगा सकते, दैट इज इंटेलिजिबल. और जब हम इस ऑर्डर के बारे में पता लगाएंगे तब हम ज्यादा फुलफिलिंग लाइफ की ओर बढ़ सकते हैं. देन नेक्स्ट थिंग वो बोलते हैं द ट्रूथ विल सेट यू फ्री. मतलब जब तुम्हें सच समझ में आ जाएगा तब तुम एम्पावर्ड फील करोगे, तब तुम लिबरेटेड हो जाओगे. और ये सारी चीजें एक्सियम्स है साइंटिफिक रिवोल्यूशन के लिए, साइंटिफिक डेवलपमेंट के लिए. अगर ये चीजें नहीं होगी तब साइंटिफिक डेवलपमेंट नहीं हो सकता, या फिर साइंटिफिक डेवलपमेंट होना बहुत मुश्किल है. एक रोबस्ट साइंटिफिक एंटरप्राइज के लिए एक रिच कल्चरल और इंटेलेक्चुअल कॉन्टेक्स्ट की जरूरत होती है जो रीजन, ट्रूथ और ह्यूमन फ्लरिशिंग को वैल्यू करता है.
Okay.
I think it's an interesting question why science emerged in Europe. I mean, and I'm not enough of a historian to know. It is even possible that Christianity did have something to do with that, and I wouldn't categorically deny that. But that doesn't in any way increase my trust in the validity of Christian propositions like the resurrection, the virgin birth, the miracles, and Jesus is the Son of God.
ये फिर से उसी बात पे आ गए कि ये चीज सही है या नहीं है, फैक्चुअल है या नहीं है. 45 मिनट्स हो चुके हैं इस कॉन्वर्सेशन में और ये इसी बात पे अटके अभी भी.
Christianity may have had some kind of historical facilitating effect that led to the Renaissance, that led to the scientific revolution, and that would be a very interesting historical analysis. But it doesn't bear upon the truth of the propositions of the Christian religion.
Okay, let's concentrate on the resurrection for a moment. Now, unfortunately, see, this is part of the problem. Part of the problem with discussions like this is that the mode of approach that's taken by the mythological tends to circle and wander. Like it doesn't, because you have to shine light on the problem from multiple perspectives. That's why it's often encoded in image, for example, or in drama. It's not the same tack as a purely propositional and logical argument, so it's more difficult to make. But let me tell you a story that I believe bears on the resurrection. You tell me what you think about it, because this is a very difficult story to account for. It's going to take me about 5 minutes because it's complicated, but there's no way around it, I don't think. So there's a strange scene in the Gospels where Christ tells his followers that unless he's lifted up like the bronze serpent, there can be no hope for the redemption of mankind unless he's lifted up like the bronze serpent in the desert. Okay, this is a very strange thing for someone to say. So you need to know what the story of the bronze serpent in the desert was and what it signifies. And I think we can understand it psychologically. I really do believe this. And the concordance of that story, which was generated millennia before with Christ's utterance, is something I just cannot imagine how anyone put those two things together, especially given the lack of explicit understanding about the relationship. So let me detail it. So there's a scene in the Exodus story, where the Israelites are doing their usual fractious foolishness and whining about the fact that they're lost and bemoaning the loss of their privileges under the Pharaoh and complaining about the power dynamics of their leadership and just generally being followers of Cain, let's say. And God, the cruel God that you refer to, decides to send among his suffering subjects poisonous snakes to bite them, which seems a little over the top, you might say. But in response to that, I would say there's no situation so terrible that some damn fool can't make it infinitely worse. And so that's what happens to the Israelites. So they're being bitten by these poisonous snakes, and the leaders of the people who've wandered from God go to Moses and they say, look, we know you've got a pipeline to God, and there's a lot of snakes and they're doing a lot of biting, and maybe you could just ask him to, call off the serpents. And so Moses, who's not very happy with the Israelites either, decides that he'll go talk to God. And God says something very strange. He doesn't say, to hell with the Israelites, more snakes is what they need. And he doesn't say, well, I produced a snake, so I'll get rid of them. He says something very, very peculiar. He says, have the Israelites gather together all their bronze and make a giant stake and put a serpent on it, a bronze serpent, which is the symbol of healing, by the way, that even the Greeks use, that symbol of Asclepius. It's a very old symbol, very widespread. It's still used by physicians today. And then he says, put it up where the Israelites can see it. And if they go look at it, then the serpent's poison won't harm them. And I read that and I thought, that's exactly what psychotherapists discovered as they all converged in the 20th century on the utility of exposure therapy as curative. And that's the pharmacon. A little of the poison that hurts you cures you. It's the same principle that's used for vaccines, by the way. So what we saw in psychotherapy is that if you get people to voluntarily confront the things that are poisoning them, so to speak, that hurt their life, that frighten them and disgust them, they become braver and more well adapted. It isn't that they become less afraid, because that's been very carefully tested. It's that they learn by watching themselves expose themselves to the things that they once fled from, that there's more to them than they think, and that generalizes across situations. And it's the same mechanism that underlies learning as such, because children, when they learn, put themselves on the edge of ragged disaster, and that's where they advance. And so what God tells the Israelites, essentially, in this dramatic endeavor, is that it's better for them to face the terrors that confront them than to be shielded from the terrors, or for them to hide from them. That they'll be better people if they face what's right in front of them, even if it's poisonous. And so it's like, okay, that's pretty damn interesting and quite remarkable. And then that symbol is used, for example, by the Greeks to symbolize medicine as such. But then there's this additional weird twist, which is Christ identifies with that bronze serpent. You think, okay, that's a very peculiar thing for anyone to do. What exactly does that mean? Well, so then you might say, well, what's the most poisonous thing that you could possibly face if you dramatized the idea of poison itself? If you wanted people to face what was worst so that they could become strongest? And the answer to that is the most unjust possible painful death and the ultimate confrontation with malevolence. And that's what's dramatized in the Passion story. Now, does that redeem everyone? Maybe. Maybe the idea is that if we were courageous enough to look death in the face unflinchingly, and if we spent our time putting our finger on the source of evil itself, it would revitalize ourselves to a degree that would be unimaginable. Now, as a biologist, you could think about this too, because I don't remember the philosopher who said it. I think it was Whitehead, but that might be wrong. We let our ideas die instead of us. Right? So human beings have evolved so that we can undergo these deaths of our own ideas and the rejuvenation that emerges in consequence of that. That seems to be something like evolution towards what? Towards the process of sacrificial logos as the thing that redeems human beings. And that makes us biologically unique too, because we can die in ideation and imagination instead of dying in actuality. Does that fundamentally redeem us? Does that deliver us from death and evil? Maybe. Like, the job isn't done, obviously.
Richard, the story that we've just heard, the Old Testament bronze serpent, it's rhyming with the New Testament Christ depicting himself as that bronze serpent. I think, from Jordan, if I may, as Richard suggests, from what I've heard you say before on this same story, there's something about that harmony between that New Testament Jesus and that Old Testament story, which is so profound and so impressive that it's difficult to imagine it having sort of naive human authorship. What do you make of that story and of that assertion?
So जॉर्डन ने जो 7 मिनट बक की जो स्टोरी सुनाई, उसको एलेक्स ने एक सेंटेंस में समराइज कर दिया कि इतनी प्रोफाउंड स्टोरी किसी ह्यूमन बीइंग द्वारा नहीं लिखी जा सकती. और डॉकिंस का इसके बारे में क्या कहना है?
Well, it doesn't impress me. I mean,
पीटरसन ने इतनी बड़ी स्टोरी सुनाई, उसका मीनिंग भी बताया, और डॉकिंस बोल रहे हैं कि इट डजंट इंटरेस्ट मी.
I don't understand why you would say that has. I don't think Jordan actually said it had divine inspiration. Maybe he did.
Not divine inspiration necessarily, but more than just, as I say, naive human authorship. Not like someone just sat down and wrote the story.
At minimum, it's a staggeringly brilliant literary move, especially given the fact that that relationship hasn't been explicated before.
Do you think, for example, if you were looking in scripture for something which would identify this as a God-given text, maybe you as a scientist would look for some scientific information. It might have told you the shape of DNA or something like that. But do you think
which Jordan actually thinks, yeah.
Yeah, we can perhaps get onto that. But do you think that a literary brilliance of a similar kind or a similar intensity, that if the Bible is not a scientific text, you might be looking for some scientific fact which you couldn't have otherwise known? Is it possible that some kind of genius moral move or literary move could also indicate that this is something more impressive?
So Dawkins फैक्ट के बारे में इतनी बार बात कर चुके हैं कि एलेक्स उनको पूछता है कि ठीक है, तुम बोल रहे हो कि इन स्टोरीज में कुछ फैक्चुअल नहीं है, लेकिन अगर इन स्टोरीज में कुछ ऐसी चीजें हैं, कुछ मॉरल चीजें हैं जो हम ले सकते हैं, जो कुछ ऐसी चीजें हैं ऑफ वैल्यू, तो क्या ये अच्छी बात नहीं है?
You more or less asked me whether what would impress me, and I'm a naive literalist, and so I would say if any prophet had said something like the world is just one object in rotating around the sun, something like that. They never do. I mean, it's always some kind of moral lesson which leaves me cold.
एलेक्स यहाँ पे पूछ रहा है कि आपको यहाँ पे स्टोरी में कुछ मॉरल लेसन दिखाई दे रहा है कि नहीं, और डॉकिंस फिर से फैक्ट्स पे आ गए हैं और वो बोल रहे हैं कि उन स्टोरीज में लिखा हुआ चाहिए था कि अर्थ सन के अराउंड रिवॉल्व कर रही है। मतलब कोई कितना क्लोज माइंडेड हो सकता है? हम यहाँ पे लिटरली मॉरल्स के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं, हम बात कर रहे हैं लिटरेचर के बारे में, हम ये बात कर रहे हैं कि क्या ये स्टोरीज लिटरेचर के हिसाब से अच्छी थी, क्या इन स्टोरीज से तुम्हें मॉरल कुछ सीख मिली? और डॉकिंस यहाँ पे बोल रहे हैं कि ये स्टोरीज हमें ये नहीं बताती कि अर्थ सन के अराउंड रिवॉल्व कर रही है। मतलब these ancient texts are not supposed to have a scientific information. साइंटिफिक इंफॉर्मेशन के लिए तुम्हारे पास साइंस के बुक्स है, तुम रिलीजियस या फिर स्पिरिचुअल स्टोरीज में साइंस क्यों ढूंढ रहे हो?
Well, why is it that there is no, I mean, they say that God meets you where you're at, right? And there are some people who just care about scientific truth. That's what they know, that's their profession.
Well,
someone like Richard. Why is there not anything in the Bible for them?
Oh, I think the idea that sacrifice is the basis of the community is a remarkable and scientifically valid hypothesis. I think that it's precisely akin to the, what would you say, to the process of cortical maturation. I think they're the same thing. Because as we mature, we move farther away from the immediate gratification of our self-centered emotional and motivational needs to a ethos of care that brings our future self into the picture and a wider and wider array of other people. And I think that's associated with cortical maturation. In fact, I think the purpose of the cortex, a purpose of the cortex is to bring the dynamics of the short-sighted underlying motivational and emotional systems into the kind of harmony that allows for communal existence and the protection of the future at the same time that the present is, what would you say, cared for and attended to. That there's a kind of harmony there. There's also a pattern there. It's not arbitrary at all. And I think we know this biologically, is that the number of ways, and I think we already alluded to this, the number of ways that a society can organize itself so that each individual can harmonize their own future with the present and do that simultaneously with many other people, there's a very limited universe of possibilities there.
डॉकिंस ने पूछा कि इन स्टोरीज में कोई साइंटिफिक क्लेम है या नहीं, और पीटरसन ने, आई डोंट नो कि ये कितना सच है, लेकिन उनके इंटरप्रिटेशन के हिसाब से उन्होंने ये एक क्लेम दे दिया कि सैक्रिफाइस का मतलब होता है कि तुम्हारा कॉर्टिकल मैच्योरेशन हो रहा है, और जब तुम मैच्योर हो जाते हो तब तुम ये सीखते हो कि तुम्हें सैक्रिफाइस करना कितना जरूरी है, और अगर तुम सैक्रिफाइस नहीं करते तो क्या नुकसान हो सकते हैं, एंड सो ऑन एंड सो। आई डोंट इवन थिंक कि हमें रिलीजियस टेक्स्ट में साइंस ढूंढना भी चाहिए, बट एनीवेज
there's a very limited universe of possibilities there. Richard
asked you before about the difference between a story or an idea naturally evolving over the course of numerous manuscripts and throughout human history, and the idea of it being divinely inspired. And you were seeming to imply that these are almost interchangeable concepts. Now, if that's the case, when you say that this divine spirit behind the Bible is actually just the way that it has evolved throughout the human history, throughout the different manuscripts that we've had, then saying that that is what divinity is, I think for you may drag the mundane up into the realm of divinity.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for people like Richard and for many people listening, what it does instead is drags the divine down to the realm of the mundane.
Very well put.
The reference I made to Harry Potter, the reference I made to The Lord of the Rings and to the Avengers, these aren't casual references. You know, we spend most of our high-end computational power generating fictional worlds where we can portray meme battles so that everyone can observe them.
Yes, so lion as genetic, dragon as mimetic. Richard, this concept of the dragon as the abstracted predator as a whole, can we talk meaningfully about the truth in these stories where instead of talking about a predator or this predator or that predator, we're talking about the concept of
The
predator as a
dragon's a
whole?
meme.
Yes.
The dragon's a meme.
Yeah.
It's a deep meme.
Well, it doesn't get me, doesn't impress me. I mean, I like reality, and it obviously impresses Jordan, and that's fine. It just, we have a different kind of mind, I think.
Well, I had a comment about that too, you know, because I actually think that's true. So there's a psychological trait, openness, and openness fractionates into two types. One type of mind is associated with deep interest in ideas. People like that tend to prefer nonfiction. A variant of that is openness proper, and it's associated with a much deeper orientation towards the fictional and metaphorical. I do think we have different kinds of minds.
So यहाँ पे डॉकिंस फिर से एक बार बोल रहे हैं कि मैं इससे इम्प्रेस नहीं हुआ, और इसको काउंटर करते हुए फाइनली जॉर्डन पीटरसन ने ये बोल दिया कि तुम क्लोज माइंडेड हो. पर्सनालिटी टाइप ओपननेस टू एक्सपीरियंस, डीप 5 पर्सनालिटी ट्रेट्स में एक ट्रेट होता है जिस पे मैंने वीडियो भी बनाया है, और पीटरसन यहाँ पे कहना चाह रहा है कि यू रैंक लोअर ऑन ओपननेस, मतलब तुम क्लोज माइंडेड हो.
It's a unity of knowledge, and I don't know if that's a presumption that you entertain or presume or share, because we could discuss the alternative. My sense is that those two pathways have to unify. Now, I don't think we know how to unify them in the West. That's why there is this conflict between the scientific and the religious. It's not like I know how to rectify that. The best I can say is this is what I've learned from studying those stories. But I would also say, because I've studied your work, I do believe that idea that you formulated of meme is exactly the same thing that Mircea Eliade is detailing out in his work. And I think the reason that he's not attended to by the universities, because he's passé in the history of religious ideas, is because everything he says demolishes the postmodern Marxists. Demolishes them, which is something that seriously needs to be done. And so I keep hoping, I think, God, it would be such a remarkable thing for Dr. Dawkins to know, especially Eliade's work, although Eric Neumann would be a close second, because it takes the notion of meme, which is what was the recreation of the world in imaginal space, and the transmission of those recreations and their potential battles. That's what you specified. And it expands it out into something that extends across millennia. It's the logical extension of your idea. And it's not like people know this, because there aren't people who know both literatures.
So this idea of lion as gene, dragon as meme, I think in so many words that it sounds like that's sort of a summary of what you're getting at. And I get the impression, Richard, that you might agree with the idea that the dragon is an effective...
So what I see here is JP डॉकिंस को बोल रहे हैं कि इलियड को पढ़ो, और वो इस चीज को डॉकिंस के ही लैंग्वेज में समझा रहे हैं, इन द लैंग्वेज ऑफ मीम्स, कि ये चीज मिमेटिक है, और तुम जिस मीम की बात कर रहे हो उस मीम के बारे में इस किताब में तुम्हें पढ़ने के लिए मिलेगा, और तुम्हें सिंबल्स और बाकी चीजों के बारे में सीखने के लिए मिलेगा. यहाँ पे जेपी इज ट्राइंग हार्ड. वो चाहते हैं कि डॉकिंस भी उन किताबों को पढ़े, वो सिंबलिज्म के बारे में पढ़े, मिथ्स के बारे में पढ़े, क्योंकि जो चीजें यहाँ पे जेपी जानते हैं वो चीजें डॉकिंस नहीं जानते. और जब ये कॉन्वर्सेशन कर रहे हैं तब ये कॉन्वर्सेशन इफेक्टिव नहीं हो पा रहा, क्योंकि जो चीजें जेपी बोल रहे हैं वो चीजें डॉकिंस ने एक्सपीरियंस नहीं की. उसके ऊपर ही इज क्लोज माइंडेड, या फिर इसको यूफेमाइज कर सकते हैं हम एज ही रैंक्स लोअर इन पर्सनालिटी ट्रेट ओपननेस. और जेपी इन शॉर्ट बोल रहे हैं कि भाई थोड़ा खुल जाओ और आजू बाजू की चीजों को भी देखो, दूसरों का पर्सपेक्टिव समझो, ये किताबें पढ़ो, तुम्हें इन किताबों से अच्छा कुछ एक नया पर्सपेक्टिव मिलेगा.
Mimetic abstraction of the concept of individual predators, but it's just not that impressive.
Yes.
It's just not that, that it's true, but it's not an impressive truth.
Impressive at the same time that you are compelled and interested by the idea of meme. I mean, let me ask you a psychological question, if you don't mind. You're obviously welcome not to answer it, but there's a reason that the idea of meme gripped you, and there's a reason it spread. It's because you put your finger on something. So can I ask you how that idea emerged and why it attracted you?
As a Darwinian, I'm interested in the process of natural selection. Natural selection is the differential survival of replicating entities. DNA is a very excellent replicating entity, whose replication and selection has given rise to the whole of life on Earth. I wanted to make the point that DNA is not the only possible replicator you could imagine.
Right?
There might be on other, and there probably is on other planets, a different kind of replicator, not DNA. And then I thought, maybe we don't have to go to other planets. Maybe there's another replicator staring us in the face, the virus of the mind, something that spreads not by DNA replication, but by imitation from mind to mind. So it could be a fashion in clothes, it could be a musical style, it could be an accent, a speech accent, it could be a children's game that spreads through school. All these things are replicators which spread by a non-genetic means and might therefore potentially be the basis for a form of Darwinian selection.
Yep.
Darwinian selection would be popularity, the spreadability of an idea.
The longevity of an idea?
Yes, longevity of an idea, the spreadability, the fidelity of it, of the idea.
How about the grip of motivation by the idea? Like, would you expect?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
that's a possibility. And I would even concede that an archetype might be one way in which certain memes might spread more than others. It might be compatible with a Jungian archetype. So that's my answer to the question. It was coming at it as a Darwinian and wanting to make the point that DNA probably, having spent the rest of the book stressing the gene as the unit of selection, I want to make the point that it may not be the only one.
Okay. So that's what I understood from your work. So it is on that grounds that I saw the concordance between what you were doing and what Eliade was doing in his investigation into the spread of religious ideas. I like what you described is what I understood. Okay, so let me ask you another question about that. Okay, so could you imagine?
तो इन शॉर्ट में मैं एक लाइन में समझा देता हूँ कि पीटरसन यहाँ पे डॉकिंस को पूछ रहे हैं कि आपने जो मीम का आइडिया प्रपोज किया वो कहाँ से आया। तो डॉकिंस यहाँ पे बोल रहे हैं कि जनरली इंफॉर्मेशन ट्रेवल करते हैं थ्रू जीन्स के अलावा भी ऐसी कुछ चीजें हो सकती है जिनसे इंफॉर्मेशन फैल सकते हैं, जिनसे चीजें फैल सकती है, जिनसे आइडियाज फैल सकते हैं, और इसको उन्होंने नाम दिया मीम्स।
Imagine a scenario where a meme had sufficient functional adaptive significance so that the individuals who acted it out gained a reproductive edge.
Yes.
Okay. So then you could imagine a situation where there was, I think I've got this right, a Baldwin effect between the meme and the genome.
Yes.
Okay. So then could you imagine an effect where the heroic hunters of the past who decided to cease acting like prey animals, maybe when they got rocks or sticks, were acting under the impulse that facing down the predator was the appropriate strategy? Because I was thinking about this reproductively. Like, you know that women are hypergamous. They like men cross-culturally about 4 years older than they are. The most fundamental female pornographic fantasy involves vampires, werewolves, pirates, surgeons, and billionaires. Dominant men who are capable of standing up to predators, who can be brought into an individual relationship. Okay, so that's the fundamental reproductive story meme that seems to drive women. It's allied with the hero myth. They're the different variants of the same story, the different sexual variants of the same story. And it seems to me it's not unreasonable to note that that's the fundamental story of humanity. And so I don't understand why you're not impressed by that.
Talking about the Baldwin effect and
So जो मैं समझ पा रहा हूँ यहाँ पे पीटरसन बोलना चाह रहे हैं कि अगर डॉकिंस बोल रहे हैं कि आइडियाज जीन्स के साथ साथ ही दूसरे मीन्स से फैल सकती है, और उन्होंने इतनी सारी बात करी अब आर्केटाइप्स के बारे में, मिथ्स के बारे में, सिंबल्स के बारे में, तो व्हाई ही इज नॉट इम्प्रेस्ड बाय दिस थिंग्स, इनसे भी तो आइडियाज फैल रही है। तो फिर डॉकिंस ये क्यों बोल रहे हैं कि आई एम नॉट इम्प्रेस्ड बाय दिस, और ये चीजें वो एक्सेप्ट क्यों नहीं कर रहे हैं?
And suddenly we got into women, what women like. I mean,
well, the men who act out the heroic meme are much more likely to reproduce.
It's an example, but perhaps we need to explain what the Baldwin.
I was going to say that's probably helpful.
Yes, that would be useful.
Okay. It was suggested by Baldwin, I think in the late 19th century. It's a kind of genetic assimilation of a cultural or a learned idea. So the idea is that certain animals learn things, learn a clever trick. It might be nut cracking by chimpanzees, for example, or potato washing by Japanese macaques, or opening milk bottles by English tits. And it perhaps spread as mimetically as an epidemic of copying, and that's known to have happened with the blue tits and great tits in Britain. Now, certain individuals are likely to learn it faster than others, and there may be genetic variation in the speed with which they learn it. And as the generations go by, natural selection would have favored speed of learning the new trick. And eventually they would have learned the new trick so fast they didn't need to learn it at all.
Right.
It becomes genetically assimilated into the genome. That's the Baldwin effect.
Okay, that I would say that's essentially the same pattern of archetype evolution that's implicit in the Jungian theoretical
Well, that's
model.
very interesting, because that suggests that Jungian archetypes might be genetically assimilated via the Baldwin effect.
Yes,
Now, that's a fascinating idea.
Yes. Okay, so now
I know we're coming to the end of our time soon anyway. It's nice to end on a shared point of interest, which is the Baldwin effect and the archetype's potential origin in the Baldwin effect. Do you think that is something that is worth exploring further? Is that something that we can
crucial
that we can
to-
test?
I think it's
सो फाइनली इतने स्ट्रगल के बाद ये एक चीज पे अग्री हो गए कि जब हम मीम्स की बात करते हैं कि जब कोई इंफॉर्मेशन ट्रैवल करती है जेनेटिकली, तो आफ्टर सर्टेन पॉइंट उस चीज का रेट इतना हाई हो जाता है कि वो चीज फिर तुम्हें लर्न करने की जरूरत नहीं पड़ती. और पीटरसन बोल रहे हैं यही तो आर्केटाइप्स है. सो मैंने मोस्ट ऑफ द वीडियो पे यहाँ पे रिएक्शन करने की कोशिश की है. आई नो कुछ पार्ट्स बाकी है क्योंकि ये बहुत बड़ा इंटरव्यू है और एक वीडियो में हम इसको कवर नहीं कर सकते. सो अगर आपको इसका सेकंड पार्ट चाहिए या फिर आप किसी स्पेसिफिक वीडियो पे रिएक्शन चाहते हो तो आप कमेंट कर सकते हो. अगर आप इस पॉइंट तक वीडियो को देख रहे हो तो वीडियो को लाइक कर दीजिए, चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और बेल आइकन को प्रेस कर दीजिए. और मैं आपको मिलता हूँ नेक्स्ट वीडियो में.